Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Legion of Honor. It's a delight to see such a large crowd here. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the director of the museums. Before I do anything, can I ask you to turn off your iPhones? Botticelli, one of the most famous artists in the world, synonymous with the Italian Renaissance. His works familiar to us all through innumerable reproductions that have become iconic. And when works become iconic like that, you kind of, sometimes you lose sight of the artist. And in this exhibition, I think we rediscover the artist. Somehow, Furio Rinaldi has managed to bring together almost all the tiny corpus of drawings that survive by Botticelli, by those in his workshop. And some of the drawings are more finished, presentation pieces, but some of the workshop drawings that really show how he thought, how his workshop operated. It's an almost miraculous reach back across more than 500 years to take us into his studio. And I'm delighted that, along with Furio, we have some of the leading scholars of the day with us this afternoon to think about the new insights that this exhibition gives us. And I'd like to especially thank our colleagues from Stanford, Los Angeles, London, and Oxford, Davide, Jacqueline, Emanuele, Michelle, and Pat for being with us and for sharing your thoughts. I also want to thank the exhibition's phenomenal lenders who've been so generous. We've got objects literally from around the world. And of course, without their generous participation, this would not be possible. I traveled with Furio just as COVID was breaking about 2 years ago. We got special permission from the Italian consulate here in San Francisco to go back into Italy ahead of any tourism. And it was remarkable. We were in Rome and Florence and not a single tourist in sight. Maybe it was because of that our colleagues seemed genuinely pleased to see us. And it was such a pleasure seeing the respect in which Furio was held. And of course, it was that respect that was key to obtaining so many of these loans. Now, my job, I have to thank the generous supporters, of whom there are many. I'm not going to read them person by person, institution by institution, but I think the size of this list demonstrates the enormous support that the Fine Art Museums have received for this exhibition. I am going to especially call out Cynthia and John Fry-Gunn, Diane B. Wilsey, our long-standing chair, and Barbara Wolf, the presenting sponsors of the exhibition, and the major support of Roger Thomas and Arthur Libera, and the Wolfgang Ratjen Foundation. And we're also very thankful to the Cultural Institute of San Francisco for providing additional support for today's program. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Furio. Furio is the acting curator in charge of the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts, an expert on 15th and 16th century Italian drawings. I first encountered Furio when he was a fellow at the Metropolitan, working on the Michelangelo exhibition. And since then, he's gone on to work through Christie's and joined us, how many years ago now? 3 years ago. And has been a center of dynamism, scholarship, and energy since joining us. And many of you will have seen the Pastels exhibition he organized a year and a half ago. He's also been making incredible acquisitions for the Achenbach department and has future plans in store, but I'm not going to talk about those. Let's focus today on Botticelli, Furio. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for the very kind introduction, and it is truly a pleasure to be with you all to celebrate the public opening of Botticelli Drawings with this international symposium. We are about to hear original scholarship from 5 outstanding academics, experts, and fellow curators who gathered here from Europe and the United States to present the results of their research on Botticelli's work, collecting history, restoration treatments, and much more. As Tom said, the exhibition gathers the vast majority of Botticelli drawings by him, by his immediate workshop, 11 of his paintings, prints, manuscripts, from 39 international lenders. An exhibition of this caliber is not an easy feat, and I would like to thank personally the leadership of Tom Campbell for believing in this project and granting it outstanding institutional support, and to our trustees as well. The exhibition opened yesterday in preview, and I usually sneak in, in the galleries to hear about comments and opinions and what people say. And I noticed a couple of instances where people were kind of frantically going between galleries looking for something, and I, approached them, and I didn't want to disturb, but kind of overhearing what they were saying, and two people were asking, "Where is the Venus? Where's the Venus?" Right. And, I didn't want to disappoint them because, letting them know that Botticelli's famous, celebrated Birth of Venus is, of course, as you know, where is it? No, it's in Venice. Today she's in Venice. Today she's in Venice. She's taking a selfie, looking fabulous. In Piazza San Marco. She was also spotted in Rome. And Capri, just, living her best life, enjoying herself. She's been spotted in Como, Italy, by the lake, but she's dressed as a Venetian, so I don't know why she's having a pizza with a side of grapes, a lemon, and just water for the Venus. So these are, some of you may know these images. These are AI-generated images featuring Botticelli's Venus, and they were part of the official advertising campaign from the Italian Ministry of Tourism, to promote travels to Italy. And, I must say there's something really endearing about this campaign. It certainly attests to Botticelli's great, massive popularity, some sort of cultural icon, widely recognized. On a more deeper level, I would say, it also attests how Botticelli's work today has been somewhat emptied of its intrinsic artistic meanings. And to this point, I found particularly telling that while they took the great advertisers of this campaign, while they took the Venus as an emblem of beauty, they also felt the need to airbrush her face as like the original wasn't appealing enough. So you see, she's kind of, more, they plumped her lips, and, they added some eyeshadow, the nose has been touched, and most importantly, they have changed the structure, the bone structure of the Venus, the kind of long neck and the shoulders, without realizing there are these kind of elongations and disproportions, these lines, in fact, that are what make and what contributes to make the Venus so appealing and interesting. And these are elements that are so intrinsic of Botticelli's aesthetic and kind of graphic appearance. All such qualities can be found in the striking portrait drawing from the Ashmolean Museum exhibited in the exhibition. Some scholars concur that the very feature of the Venus in the Birth of Venus are based on the likes of Simonetta Vespucci, who was possibly the sitter for this incredible portrait drawing. So the goal of the exhibition is in fact, to go beyond the surface and the superficial and the mythology surrounding Botticelli's art and life, and investigate the core element that make his work so memorable, so magnetic, even to today's imagery, namely his drawings, the vigor of his graphic structure. Seen through the lens of drawing, the seventh section of the exhibition traced the artist's entire journey and artistic trajectory, from his training under Fra Filippo Lippi. You see two of his drawings here, a master draftsman and towering figure of the early Renaissance. We go through Botticelli's early figure studies for his seminal compositions from the 1470s, the Primavera, the Adoration of the Magi, the Saint Sebastian. Newly attributed works that attest to his incredible perspicuity in portraiture and in capturing the likenesses of his models and in preparation of his paintings. And then into the later, more expressive and sometimes impenetrable late design from his later career. So these drawings highlight the graphic articulations of Botticelli's ideas, allow an unprecedented understanding of the artist's process, also thanks to some direct comparison between drawings, preparatory drawings, and final paintings, as in the case for the last Adoration of the Magi. So the 5 papers that we will present shortly will touch upon aspects that expand even further the scope of this exhibition. As I said, we will discuss collecting history, the fortune of Botticelli, symbolic meanings and aspects behind his works. I'm immensely grateful to the 5 speakers that are here with us today that have joined us with a great, in the spirit of sharing their knowledge kind of, in alignment with what the scope of the exhibition was, to go beyond the surface and the obvious. I must also add that this lecture, is a first one of our incredible program of public programs that we have organized with our team here. You see the upcoming appointments for the free Saturdays, but we will have much more also on our digital platforms. And I want to thank, as always, the exhibition team, the public programs, education, our digital department, who produced the beautiful hero film, the documentary that you see in the gallery ahead of the exhibition. So thank you all, my colleagues, for their amazing contribution that have elevated the quality of the exhibition itself. Thank you. And we are starting with our first speaker, who's Davide Gasparotto, is the Senior Curator of Paintings and Chair of Curatorial Affairs at the J. Paul Getty Museum in LA. A native of Bassano del Grappa, Italy, he studied art history and classical archaeology at the University of Pisa and the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa. He was director of the Fondazione Piero della Francesca in San Sepolcro and spent 12 years as a curator of the Galleria Nazionale in Parma. He was also director at the Galleria Estense in Modena and had an accomplished curatorial career and museum career with many fellowships, including the Francis A. Yates Fellowship at the Warburg Institute in London, Paul Mellon Visiting Senior Fellowship at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So thank you and welcome to Davide Gasparotto.
Thank you very much, Furio, for this very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here in San Francisco, and I had the pleasure of spending the morning in the exhibition, which looks fabulous, really deep, thought-provoking, challenging in some way, but wonderful show. So we'll deep dive a little bit into the fortune of Botticelli, how Botticelli was rediscovered, reappreciated, and collected in England especially, and then especially in the United States. On November 22, 1958, Sir Kenneth Clarke, the former director of the National Gallery in London, wrote to the art historian Bernard Berenson with a report on his recent trip to Canada and the United States. Recalling his visit to Boston, he remarked, "It was very agreeable to find the Gardner collection unchanged, and what beautiful things you made her buy. I had forgotten how fine the Botticelli is, or rather both of them are, and the Pollaiolo profile is astonishing. It was a sunny afternoon, and I have never seen Titian look so well. It remains the most beautiful picture in America." We don't know what the elderly Berenson, he was 93 years old and would pass away the following year, thought when reading this letter. He was probably flattered, and perhaps those words took him back to the years of his brilliant youth, with a mixture of pride and regret, since he was the only survivor of that exciting season. His wife, Mary, advisor and key contributor to his professional success, had died in 1945, while the collector Isabella Stewart Gardner had passed away decades earlier in 1924. Together with other wealthy Bostonians, Isabella had contributed money for Bernard's extensive travels in Europe after his graduation from Harvard in 1887. The two then lost touch until March 1894, when Bernard sent her a copy of his newly published book, The Venetian Painters of the Renaissance, the first of a successful series that would consecrate his reputation as one of the leading connoisseurs of his time. A few months later, Isabella asked his opinion about some paintings on the market. On August 1st, he responded with a question: "How much do you want a Botticelli?" offering her the chance to buy a painting by the great Florentine master with the story of Lucretia. According to Berenson, this work, owned at the time by Lord Ashburnham, was a Cassone picture to rival the Calumny at the Uffizi. He led Isabella to believe that, although the owner was not keen to sell the picture, he might be persuaded with a generous offer. The truth was that Berenson was already in touch with Otto Gutekunst, a new partner of the Colnaghi firm in London, who was dealing directly with the Lord Ashburnham. The British aristocrat received a cheque of £2,500, while the final cost for Mrs. Gardner was £3,400, which included Colnaghi's profit and Berenson's commission. This transaction established a pattern that would last for several years, delivering some of the masterpieces still on view at the Gardner and granting Berenson a steady income. In flowery rhetoric, Berenson extolled the artistic merit of each picture, establishing its rarity and noble provenance, and suggesting that the owner could be enticed to sell with the right offer. Much of this was fabrication, since many works were already owned or handled by Colnaghi. Isabella paid Berenson a 5% advisory fee on each acquisition, but he also received a substantial share of the profits from Gutekunst, generally between 15 and 20%. Bernard Berenson and Mary Smith Costello, not yet husband and wife, had been romantically involved since 1888. As much as a love affair, their relationship was based on a profound intellectual affinity and common scholarly interests. They were already deeply engaged with Botticellian matters when, in 1894, Bernard proposed to Isabella that she acquire the painting with the story of Lucretia. Mary was collecting materials for a book on Botticelli, and she and Bernard were preparing two independent and highly critical reviews of a volume on the same topic published the year before by Hermann Ullmann, a German scholar and a pupil of Willem Bode. For Isabella, here an image of the story of Lucretia in the house in Beacon Street of Isabella, and then the first display in the museum, in the Gardner Museum, flanked by Raphael and Carlo Crivelli. For Isabella, the Botticelli was the most expensive object she had bought to date and the true beginning of her collection of Italian Renaissance paintings. Between 1894 and 1899, Gardner purchased at least 26 paintings and sculptures through Berenson, including works by Fra Angelico, Crivelli, Raphael, and Titian. At the time, Italian Renaissance art might have appeared an eccentric choice for an American collector. Edith Wharton looked back at the preferences of American collectors in her novella False Dawn, in which the heir to a New York industrial fortune is sent to Europe by his father to buy Baroque pictures, and returns instead with early Renaissance works by Giotto, Macrino d'Alba, Piero della Francesca, Mantegna, acquired on the advice of John Ruskin. As a consequence, his father disinherits the son, who puts the works on public display trying to sell them, and in the end, not able to find a buyer, dies in poverty. It is a story that has some affinity with the fate of the collection of Italian primitives assembled in the 1850s in Italy by James Jackson Jarvis, works which in 1871 ended up almost unnoticed at the Yale University Art Gallery, where we technically find the first painting by Botticelli that came to America, although we can see it's a studio work, it's a work from the workshop. In contrast, in Europe at the end of the 19th century, Botticelli's reputation was at its peak due to an overall revival of interest for Italian painters of the early Renaissance, part of a general shift in taste, wittily summarized by the playwright and literary critic George Bernard Shaw in 1895. Quote, "The once fashionable admiration of the Renaissance and the old masters of the 16th and 17th century has been swept away by the growth of a genuine sense of the naive dignity and charm of 13th century work, and a passionate affection of the exquisite beauty of 15th century work. So that nowadays 10 acres of Carracci, Giulio Romano, Guido, Domenichino, and Pietro di Cortona will not buy an inch of Botticelli or Lippi or John Bellini. No, not even with a few yards of Raphael thrown in." John Ruskin, the most influential British art critic of the 19th century, took some credit for the change. In 1883, he declared in the introduction to his Modern Painters, "It was left to me, and to me alone, first to discern and then to teach the excellency and supremacy of 5 great painters, despised until I spoke of them: Turner, Tintoretto, Luini, Botticelli, and Carpaccio." This claim was certainly exaggerated. The first reference to Botticelli in Ruskin's writings is his encomium upon the mystic nativity, which he admired in an exhibition at the Royal Academy in 1871. In 1874, he traveled to Rome and was enchanted by Botticelli's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, especially by the figure of Zipporah in the scene with the trials of Moses, later described by Ruskin as the Etruscan Athena becoming queen of a household in Christian humility. But although he declines to acknowledge other writers on art, Ruskin must have known the book by François Riot, De la Poésie chrétienne, published in Paris in 1836, which was translated in English in 1854, and which included a long and inspired description of Botticelli's Vatican frescoes. Ruskin was also certainly familiar with the first modern account of Botticelli's art and career, included in the New History of Painting in Italy by Crowe and Cavalcaselle, published in 1864, a careful analysis of extant paintings and the main early source on the artist, Vasari's life, published for the first time in 1550. Here we see the edition of 1568 with the frontispiece with the profile of Botticelli. The enthusiasm for Botticelli in the milieu of the pre-Raphaelites also significantly predates Ruskin's references to the Florentine painter. Already in 1858, Elizabeth Rigby, the wife of the influential director of the National Gallery in London, Sir Charles Eastlake, wrote to her friend Jane Gifford, who was traveling to Italy. I can do little more than encourage you, while you are enjoying the very meridian of art in the various specimens of Raphael, to try and fill your heart, especially with the grandeur and earnestness of the great four, Sandro Botticelli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, Fra Filippo Lippi, and his son Filippino Lippi, who constitute the core of Florentine art. In 1865, the archaeologist and collector Austin Henry Layard, writing to Lady Eastlake from Florence, conveyed to her the enthusiasm of the painter John Everett Millais for a series of paintings by Botticelli, then in the house of Marchese Pucci. We went to see the 4 pictures by him in the Pucci Palace, which are for sale, and we agreed that Sir Charles must secure these for the National Gallery. I have not seen them before and was surprised to find such magnificent works of this rare master for sale. For exquisite beauty of execution, for the interest of the subject, and for illustrations of manners and costume of the 15th century, they are unrivaled. Millais was immensely struck with them. Dante Gabriele Rossetti, who never set foot in Italy, in 1849 became enamored of the so-called Madonna of the Rose Garden, which we have here in the exhibition, which he saw in the Louvre together with his friend and painter William Holman Hunt. Later, in 1867, Rossetti acquired the so-called portrait of Smeralda Bandinelli, also in the exhibition, which clearly had an impact on his own portraits and allegories, especially on the famous La Donna alla Finestra here on this slide. Meanwhile, the cultivated Edward Burne-Jones had developed an interest in Botticelli, starting from his first trip to Italy in 1859. In 1876, he wrote to Agnes Graham, the young daughter of one of his major patrons. I want to see Botticelli's calumny ad Uffizi dreadfully, and the spring in the Belle Arti, and the dancing choir that goes hand in hand up to heaven over the heads of 4 old men in the same dear place. You know them all by now, and if those angels are photographed, will you buy them for me? At some point, Burne-Jones even owned 2 paintings attributed to Botticelli, one of which you can see here on the screen, today considered modest products of the artist's workshop. The culmination of the fascination for the Florentine Renaissance painter, predating also Ruskin's enthusiasm, is certainly represented by 2 influential essays published respectively in 1868 and 1870 in the Fortnightly Review. Notes on Drawings of Old Masters in Florence by the poet Algernon Charles Swinburne, and a fragment on Sandro Botticelli by Walter Pater. These hailed Botticelli as a poetical and visionary painter, champion of a refined and extreme sensibility, which is expressed in the protagonist of his sacred and profane paintings, I quote, infused with a sense of displacement and loss, full of a sentiment of ineffable melancholy and of a faint and almost painful grace. Botticelli's trajectory from obscurity to celebrity is perfectly exemplified by the 19th century history of the mystic nativity, which is obviously one of the great masterpieces which we can admire here in the exhibition. The British amateur William Young Otley bought the picture in Rome in 1799 from the Aldobrandini family. In 1811, he tried unsuccessfully to sell it, and in 1826 included an engraving of the lower portion of the painting in a pioneering publication devoted to the early and it's truly admirable. I have admired it today. It's wonderful. In 1835, the German art historian Gustav Friedrich Wagen, traveling in England, mentioned the picture with great admiration. A very spirited and, considering the vehement character of the master, a most remarkable picture. The execution is for him slight, but full of spirit. When the picture was shown at the famous Art Treasures exhibition in Manchester in 1857, one reviewer observed that Botticelli's works have of late years become very popular amongst collectors in this country. The painting was finally acquired by the National Gallery from the collection of William Fuller Maitland in 1878. By the 1880s, the name of Botticelli was such a symbol of cultural sophistication that the British caricaturist Georges Dumouriez, whose illustrations for Punch were acute commentaries on the Victorian scene, invented a joke where one fashionable youth reproved another upon being asked if he liked Botticelli, had answered that he preferred Chianti. Botticelli isn't a wine, you juggins, it's a cheese, replied the other. At the turn of the century, in Gilded Age America, sensational purchases and transatlantic displacements granted old master paintings a novel exposure, which transformed the public perception of these works. As Flaminia Gennari has pointed out, the purchases of European masterpieces became a sophisticated metaphor with which to extol the free market, tell the story of the nation's acquisition of culture, of European decadence, of the successful application of the American approach to finance to the ancient practice of art collecting, of the emergence of American taste as a new actor in the sphere of Western culture. It also transformed the international art market and set the ways in which Europe and the United States dealt and still deal with the Western cultural heritage, triggering debates in several countries over the definition of national patrimony and the means of protecting it. In this new landscape, newspapers played a pivotal role. Old master paintings made their American debut in the pages of newspapers and periodicals like the New York Times, The Nation, Century, Scribner's, and McClure's, where writers, experts, and tastemakers constructed a new journalistic genre around the Americanization of European old masters. These headlines gave rise to an intense public debate about the national desire for cultural and social distinction, the public function of private wealth, the improvement of popular education and manufacture, the development of public museums, and the professionalization of the American art world. Isabella Gardner's second purchase of a painting by Botticelli, the so-called Madonna Chigi, perfectly exemplifies some of these dynamics. Like many other Italian aristocrats of the time, the Roman Prince Mario Chigi was looking for buyers for several paintings from his collection. Isabella first heard of Botticelli's Madonna in 1898 from Richard Norton, the son of Charles Eliot, the professor of fine arts at Harvard and a great friend of Mrs. Gardner. A few years earlier, the painting had been published as the only authentic Botticelli in a Roman collection by the great connoisseur Giovanni Morelli. Isabella inquired with Berenson, who was already secretly acting in association with Gutekunst from Colnaghi and another English dealer, Asher Wertheimer. The prince played on the rivalry between various potential buyers to raise the price, and in the end Colnaghi managed to purchase the painting for the astronomical sum of £12,000, 3 times higher than their original offer. Immediately afterwards, the painting was illicitly exported from Italy by one of Colnaghi's partners. The case caused a scandal in Italy, and the prince had to stand trial and was sentenced, at least initially, to pay a huge fine. Following several appeals, the charges were later withdrawn. The case of the Madonna Chigi, however, contributed to a broader debate on how to define and protect national heritage, a debate that ultimately led to the first laws on the export of works of art in post-unification Italy, enacted in 1902 and 1909. A similar debate was also taking place at the same time in England, another country which was experiencing a massive exodus of works of art toward America, as recalled in a short and brilliant novel by Henry James, The Outcry, published in 1911, and inspired by the story of the attempted export of a masterpiece by Hans Holbein, the famous portrait of Christina of Denmark, that you can see here, why an American is trying to steal from England. After Colnaghi won the Botticelli painting, Berenson, who a few months earlier had tried to dissuade Isabella from purchasing it with the excuse that the work was not in good condition, which was untrue, and that it was too expensive, now had the task of rekindling his client's enthusiasm. He succeeded with one of his most astute letters. You will scarcely get the picture for under £15,000, a monstrous sum. Yes, in itself monstrous, but Italian pictures have risen at least to 5 times their value in the last 4 years. It is the last universally accepted Botticelli in the market. Among his Madonnas is one of the noblest and grandest. If you don't take it, the Paris Rothschilds almost certainly will. So, if you can spare the money, you after all would be paying more than the market value of the picture at present, possessing yourself of a truly great masterpiece and snatching out of the teeth of worthy rivals. Isabella acquired the work for £14,500 and agreed for it to be exhibited in London in November 1901 at the Colnaghi Gallery, where it was finally revealed who the buyer was. The exhibition attracted, that's the catalogue of the exhibition. The exhibition attracted crowds, but it was cut short by Isabella herself when she learned that the Colnaghi firm organized it on behalf of a charitable trust without having asked for her permission to do so. She was enraged and asked for the immediate shipment of the painting to Boston. She never had sympathy for Colnaghi, but this incident definitively severed her relationship with the firm, observing to Berenson that they had killed the goose that laid the golden egg. Her final Botticelli acquisition was presented to her by her friend Richard Norton, who wrote about the famous Antinori Botticelli, the most beautiful picture by him that I have ever seen, a finer picture than the Chigi one, and in much better condition. She bought the Tondo without consulting Berenson. When he and Mary visited Fenway Court in 1903, they were horrified to see the Nativity Tondo hanging opposite the Chigi Madonna. Mary reported that Bernard nearly fainted away and that they were absolutely petrified with horror and disgust, although this may have been partially attributable to the realization that he no longer had a monopoly as Gardner's art advisor. Questions of attribution, autography, and the role of workshop assistants became central in Botticelli's scholarship at the turn of the 19th century, and they are still key questions for our understanding of his art today, as we can also see in Furio's show. Distinguishing between Botticelli tout court, Botticelli an assistant, workshop of Botticelli, follower of Botticelli, obviously have a significant impact on market prices, back then as today. And it is in this realm that the figure of the connoisseur came to play a crucial part. In 1905, in Siena, the parodist and caricaturist Max Beerbohm presenting the art historian Herbert Horn with a very peculiar portrait drawing. Under the title Celestial Attributions, we see the Virgin pronouncing the words, "This is a very doubtful horn," while the child says, "It seems to me rather as if it might be an early Berenson," to whom the Virgin replies, "Pooh, nonsense, bah, everything points to its being a particularly late Löser." The man has the provisional label, Scuola di Amico di Max, early Venticento. The man is, of course, Horn himself. There is perhaps no better description of the rhabdomantist nature of the art connoisseur and of how the exercise of establishing the authorship of a painting, distinguishing multiple hands, and understanding the internal chronology with the oeuvre of a certain painter was perceived by the uninitiated. Herbert Horn published his monumental book on Botticelli in 1908, after 13 years spent in the Florentine archives and visiting the most important collections in Italy and Europe. The reviewers, and in particular the critic Roger Fry, immediately bestowed upon the book the status of a classic, and it remains today one of the most accomplished monographs ever written on a Renaissance artist. Horn's book is on the one hand dominated by documentary research, aimed at a meticulous reconstruction of the circumstances of Sandro's career and his relationship with his patrons, and on the other, a rigorous exercise in recognition of the artist's autograph works. In the words of Horn himself, the only valuable function of the connoisseur is to distinguish the genuine production of a master from those of his imitators, and to disengage and note the significant qualities of such genuine works. Having acquired a great expertise on Botticelli, Horn became a dangerous competitor of Berenson as an advisor to American collectors. In the fall of 1908, Horn drew to the attention of Roger Fry, who was then acting as agent for the Metropolitan Museum, a predella by Botticelli with the stories of Mary Magdalene, which was owned by the Florentine dealer Luigi Grassi. Horn was convinced that the panels came from the altarpiece for the Church of the Convertite and that Botticelli executed it before going to Rome to paint in the Sistine Chapel. The predella enchanted Fry, who presented it as a potential acquisition for the Metropolitan. Surprisingly, it was refused by the trustees. At that point, Fry advised the collector John J. Johnson from Philadelphia to buy it. Johnson was the classic example of the post-Civil War self-made man who, born into a family of humble origins, rose to become the country's foremost business lawyer. He began acquiring old master paintings in the 1890s, a little bit like Isabella, and built a network of advisors which included the most prominent scholars of his time. Johnson bought the Botticelli without even having seen the panels in the flesh, which arrived in Philadelphia at the end of December. The Berensons were in the United States, and they were eager to see the paintings in preparation for the catalogue of the collection that Johnson had entrusted Bernard to compile. Berenson's reaction was unexpected. He pronounced that the pictures were by Amico di Sandro, an anonymous artistic personality very close to Botticelli that he had reconstructed in an article published in 1899. Fry was extremely upset, and Horn was enraged. He wrote to Johnson, "For myself, I have no doubt whatsoever about the correctness of my own attribution. If I am wrong, I have studied Botticelli assiduously for more than 10 years to no purpose. As for the attribution to Amico, it is monstrous and ridiculous. Mr. Berenson's Amico is a farrago of good, bad, and indifferent, but with one early exception, all the pictures show Filippinesque traits." Later, Berenson not only accepted that the predella was indeed by Botticelli, but it was proved that Horn was right in refuting Berenson's construct of Amico di Sandro, since the great majority of the paintings that he assigned to this anonymous painter were later accepted as works by the young Filippino Lippi. After the First World War, the continuous migration of Botticelli's paintings to America is well documented through a luxury publication in 3 volumes from 1933, Italian Paintings in America, by the Italian art historian Lionello Venturi. Of the 17 paintings assigned to Botticelli in his book, 7 were at the time in public collections, 2 at the Gardner, 2 in Philadelphia, 2 at the Metropolitan in New York, and 1 at the Fogg Museum in Cambridge. 40 years later, in 1972, Burton Frederiksen and Federico Zeri listed 20 autograph works by Botticelli, 28 labeled as school shop studio work, and 4 by followers in their census of pre-19th century paintings in North American public collections. The most significant increase happened in conjunction with the foundation of the National Gallery of Art in Washington in 1937. It is a story that has 4 well-known protagonists, 2 collectors, Andrew W. Mellon and Samuel H. Kress, and 2 dealers, Joseph Duveen and George Wildenstein, who dominated the international art market between the 2 wars. 5 of the paintings that you can see here on the screen were acquired between 1931 and 1948 by Mellon and Kress from Duveen or Wildenstein, except the Adoration of the Magi, which was part of the spectacular group of paintings that Mellon acquired from the Hermitage in St. Petersburg through a consortium of dealers that included Mathiesen from Berlin, Colnaghi from London, and Knoedler from New York, possibly the boldest art acquisition of the 20th century. While the acquisition from the Soviet Union of the Adoration of the Magi and other great paintings by Raphael and great masters represents an exploit without any comparison, the sequence of events that brought the portrait of a youth to Washington perfectly summarizes the story that I've tried to sketch out for you today. Coming from a French aristocratic collection, the painting was acquired in 1920 by Duveen, in part share agreement with Wildenstein and Arnold Seligman. The following year, it was consigned to Carl W. Hamilton, a self-made millionaire from humble beginnings. The painting drew notice on the front page of American Art News, headlined, "Has the American art world, in the person of this modest and ambitious new collector, a possible successor to Frick or Johnson?" At the same time, Berenson published the portrait in the periodical Art in America. Shortly afterward, due to financial difficulties, Hamilton returned the painting to Duveen. The work is subsequently documented at Harbor Inn, the house you see there on the screen, the opulent Long Island mansion of the collector Clarence Mackay, designed by McKim, Mead and White, the most fashionable architectural firm of the time. Unfortunately, the house was later demolished. In 1930, as a consequence of the Great Depression, Mackay began to sell his extraordinary collection, again with the assistance of Duveen brothers. In 1936, the picture was acquired by Mellon, who gave it to the newly founded National Gallery the following year. Coming now to our generation, and to conclude my presentation, the attempted acquisition of the Weems Madonna by the Campbell Art Museum in 1999 in some way reenacted the opposition between the old and new worlds that we have seen operating at the beginning of the 20th century. On one side, the desire, granted by enormous wealth, of appropriating an iconic painting of the Renaissance, and on the other, the preoccupation of preserving a patrimony which is considered an essential component of the cultural identity of a nation. Despite the fact that the love affair with European old master paintings seems rather in decline today in the United States, supplanted by great fashion for contemporary art, the star of Botticelli still shines when one of his important works appears on the art market, as was demonstrated by the record prices recently fetched by the portrait of a man with a medallion, or the Tondo with a reduced version of the Madonna del Magnificat, which you can see here on screen. The marketing strategies employed by auction houses to entice the billionaires of today, the last Botticelli in private hands, fabulous condition, may sound to us familiar and quite tired, but they are still effective. Both works remained after the sales in private hands. But, as for many of the paintings that I have shown today, we can always hope that one day they will grace the walls of a public institution. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic talk. Hold your thoughts or questions as we will have a Q&A moment after this talk, which is presented by Jacqueline Thallmann, the curator since 2003 of Christ Church Picture Gallery in Oxford. As you've seen, one of our really great lenders to this exhibition with 2 Botticelli drawings and a fantastic series of sea-bills from Filippino Lippi and Botticelli. Before she joined Christ Church, Thallmann worked at the Sir John Soane Museum in London and at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Her extensive university education had made her alumna of the Ludwig Institute of Art, Maximilian University in Munich, Bert Brecht University in Augsburg, Germany, the Courtauld Institute of Art London, and the Humboldt University in Berlin. Her research interests have focused on the perception of antiquity in Western art, and since coming to Oxford, they have circled around the Christ Church Picture Gallery collection, which is absolutely outstanding, with an extensive exhibition program, and through her teaching at Oxford University. So please welcome Jacqueline Thallmann. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Furio, and thank you for the invitation, and congratulations to an absolutely wonderful exhibition. And I think it was about time that sort of someone brings paintings into a drawings exhibition. I sort of think it's the first time that this drawings exhibition is combining different media, combining sort of different media, and therefore I sort of think it will be, you know, au point. So wonderful, thank you. Well. This is a work in progress, which I probably will sort of say several times during my talk, so bear with me, and I'm waiting for comments and ideas from everyone here, treating this more or less like a research seminar in Oxford. So, but let me start. In 1828, Christ Church, Oxford, received a gift of several early Italian panel paintings from a former student, William Thomas Honer Fox Strangways, later the 4th Earl of Ilchester. Among them were 2 panels, each depicting 5 female figures, each sitting in an architectural niche. Amongst there were also Lippi and Hugo van der Roos and quite a lot of other sort of works, but we'll talk about this one here now. Inscriptions identified the figures as the Sibyls, female prophets named after their geographical places of origin. The texts running on a painted scroll at the bottom of the panel are entitled Dicta Sibyllarum. All right, here. And give short passages from the prophecies, the Sibylline oracles. At the time of the panel's arrival in Christ Church, one of the largest Oxford colleges, Christ Church already had an important and publicly open art museum since 1768, and I would like to stress that because it makes us the first art gallery in Britain. But the collection did not have any Italian paintings created before 1500. This gift, therefore, added a new visual experience to the collection and indeed the entire British art world, making them one of the earliest Botticelli panels in England and certainly the first on permanent display in Britain. So here you have, we had already by a former sort of old member been given 2,000 drawings, among them many early Italian drawings, so quite a lot of Lippi drawings, and the 2 drawings that Furio just recently attributed to Botticelli as well, which are in the exhibition. It might be interesting to remember that this was several decades, 1828, before Botticelli would be rediscovered by the British, and almost a Botticelli mania swept the country, fueled by the writings of John Ruskin and Walter Pater and the art of the Pre-Raphaelites. To put it in context, just to put the times there, John Ruskin was just 9 years old when the panels were displayed in Christ Church in 1828, and Pater not yet born. The name of Botticelli, therefore, was still fairly unknown when the panels were first mentioned in writing in a short catalogue of the Christ Church collection in 1833. 5 years after their arrival. And you can see there, number 109 and 110, figures, Sibyls, Alessandro Botticelli 1T, and the same subject, the same. And to explain sort of what they were, and that's, as I say, 1833. Fox Strangways most likely bought them in Florence when he was the British envoy to the city. But we know nothing about the provenance before then, and no earlier documentation about the paintings or the commissions are known. It was certainly an inspired purchase by Fox Strangways, and one that was ahead of his time. With the ascent of Botticelli becoming the quintessential artist of the Florentine Renaissance, the Sibyl received more recognition, but remained at the margins of the artist's oeuvre. This was partly due to their unsatisfactory conservational state and the stylistic differences of the two panels. Over the last 2 centuries, the attribution swayed from Botticelli to school of Botticelli to follower of Botticelli to Filippino Lippi and, of course, Bernard Berenson's L'Amico di Botticelli, and then back to Botticelli. The dating, however, remained fairly consistent, placing the panels in Botticelli's workshop in the early years of the first part of the 1470s, when Filippino Lippi, the son of the master, of Botticelli's master, and the young associate, was working alongside him. Here is not the time to tell the sort of story of their attribution in detail, but just to conclude that the differences in the painting led to a distinction very sensitively voiced in writing for the first time by James Byam Shaw in 1967 and cemented by Patrizia Zambrano in her and Jonathan Nelson's monumental study on Filippino Lippi. So let me, here the left is given to Botticelli and the right to Lippi, the right panel to Lippi. And I will refer to them sort of as Botticelli and Lippi, sort of always just to make it easier, even with the drawings where we will have to discuss what is happening there. It is now broadly, but not universally accepted, that the panel showing the Persian, or Babylonian as some call it, Libyan, Delphic, Cimmerian, and Eritrean Sibyls on the left is by Botticelli, and the one showing the Samian, Cumaean, Hellespontic, Phrygian, and Tiburtine Sibyls on the right by the younger collaborator, Filippino Lippi. I will also refer to them by this distinction, as I said. Before pointing out the differences that can already be seen with the naked eye, let me say a little more about the subject matter of the panels, the Sibyls. This will give you some time also to adjust your eyes to see the subtle differences sort of yourself, because they are very visible. The ancient Greeks knew 9 of these ancient female prophets and referred to by their geographical sort of locations where the miracles, where the oracles were sort of spoken. A 10th, a Roman one, the Tiburtine sort of Sibyl, was added by the Roman writer Varro. The main source, also he is the main source of the sort of Sibylline knowledge. And these 10 figures are depicted here. That's not irrelevant, as around the time Botticelli conceived the idea for these panels, and I think we're pretty sure that it's Botticelli's design and idea, the canon of the 10 was extended to 12 Sibyls. In 1481, the Dominican friar Filippo de Barberi added 2 Sibyls, 12 just being a number that was much more adaptable for Christian typology or iconography. The 12 Sibyls sort of soon became the new canon. A set of engravings of the 12 by the Florentine engraver Baccio Baldini. This is important as Baccio Baldini is associated with Botticelli and the Dante, sort of some of the Dante illustrations he engraves. And Vasari even sort of says of Baldini and accuses him that he has no creative bone in his body, and all the designs are by Botticelli. But at that time, so he printed the sort of a series of Botticelli of Sibyls. Despite Vasari's remarks, Baldini's Sibyls make hardly any reference to Botticelli. Most of his figures are modeled from sources provided by Northern European prints. And here you have on the left the Delphic sort of Sibyl, and there the idea he has the figure from Master ES, a German print, And the engraving has been reversed. It's the other sort of side, and sort of slightly modified for the female figure. But that is his source that he has. So the dating of those is in flux. So all these sort of things have to be just borne in mind for now. But let's go back to the sort of symbols. The total lack of attributes. Sort of the other sort of thing that is should be noted. Let me go sort of back here. Not yet. How do we go back? We can't go back. We can't go back. Anyway, how do we? No. Anyway, sort of so the prince and all the Baldini Sibyls have attributes. Not only attributes, they have scrolls and books. And this is sort of something that's absolutely lacking in the Botticelli. So the total lack of attributes in the Christchurch Sibyls, not even a book, is a significant pictorial as well as intellectual decision. The absence of any attribute makes it clear that the Sibylline knowledge and wisdom is not a learned one, but a divinely received one. The beginning of the inscriptions read Dicta Sibyllarum, sort of the inscription at the bottom says Dicta Sibyllarum. It was said by the Sibyls, emphasizing further that the Sibyls voice the revelations that they received from a higher divine authority. This visionary speaking is also visualized in the rhythm of the figures, their varying speaking hands and gestures. And as I can't go back, I'm sorry, you will have to wait for this a little longer. This ties perfectly well in with the humanist trends in Florence at the time, and specifically with the Neoplasticism of Marsilio Ficino, placing these panels in a specific theological and intellectual milieu that Botticelli knew. Ficino's De Christiana Religione, published in 1474, distinguishes the Sibyls with their divine inherent wisdom from the ancient prophets and theologians. The latter's knowledge comes from learning and study, from an interpretation of already written texts, rather than revelations from a divine authority that are offered by the sort of Sibyls. The subject matter allows Botticelli to give his paintings a classical appearance, while the inscriptions on both panels have a strong Christian message. The text in Botticelli's panel, with the Persian, Libyan, Delphic, Cimmerian, and Eritrean Sibyl, refers to the coming of Christ and the resurrection. It begins with, translated, "Hear me, men, the eternal King rules." Filipinos, of the Sumerian, Cumaean, Hellespontic, Phrygian, and Tiburtine Sibyls, refers to the second coming of Christ and the last judgment, ending with then at last he will send the sort of impires into the fire and the darkness. The just, however, will be restored to life. While the subject matter is one, the distinction of the prophecies in sort of the first coming, the second coming, the last judgment, allows two separate panels to be created, yes, with such a similarity and sort of such a similar concept that creating 5 distinct variations of figures in niches, communicating in their own rhythm, can almost become a friendly competition between two artists. I'm not sort of suggesting this was a competition between Botticelli and sort of Lippi, but one can imagine that there was sort of some rivalry going on. The most obvious difference between the two panels sort of is the treatment of the figures. Can we go back? Yeah. Can you? You can. Because I can't on the. Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much. So here. So where were we? The most obvious differences between the two panels is the treatment of the figures. In the Botticelli panel, they are clad in heavier, layered, multicolored garments that have been given various material properties, as can be seen in the different treatment of the folds in the draperies. The variations in the headgear are also more pronounced than in the Lippi panel, where the figures are clad in enveloping, looser, monocolored garments. This also affects the positioning of the figures within the architectural spaces. While Botticelli's Sibyls sit in their niches, Lippi's are almost hovering, almost sort of squatting in front of them. And their upper bodies are more elongated, while the architecture is sort of similar there are variations in the treatment too, as can be seen later. In both panels, the architecture is precisely outlined with incised lines converging from one central point in the lap of the middle Sibyl, the Delphic and the Hellespontic respectively. However, the central point in the left, the Botticelli panel, is about 3 inches lower than the one in the Lippi panel. And that, because we have them also in Christchurch next to each other, makes the whole sort of thing look very confusing, but I do not think that they might have been placed like that originally. These are the two most obvious differences that can be distinguished with the naked eye and together with some other stylistic criteria, for example, the types of faces, which due to the abrasions on the paintings I find more difficult to argue with, were the reason to place the Sibyls in a group with other collaborative Botticelli and Lippi works and to date them in the time of the coloration. As is well known, Lippi is mentioned in Botticelli's workshop in 1472, but as Michel O'Malley significant research on Botticelli's workshop and the collaboration of Botticelli and Lippi showed, the partnership was probably a much longer one. Not being able to gain more information from the panel's painted surface, we hoped to gain more knowledge about the genesis of these panels and the production process by looking under the painted surface with the help of infrared reflectography, a non-invasive imaging technique that penetrates certain paint layers in order to visualize carbon-heavy media like charcoal and black chalk. Carbon cannot be penetrated by infrared rays, therefore making the early designs, if carried out in that medium, visible. And indeed, we could reveal, and sadly, my big reveal has already happened, but I was so proud of that blending. And indeed, we could reveal some underdrawings, which, while clearly different from one another, pose more questions than they answer, which, as I say, makes this very much a work in progress. But this now, I mean, you just sort of saw it, but for the very first time, these are the underdrawings. These have never been revealed before, so you are the first people to see what happened under those sort of paintings, what happened in the workshop, so to speak. Apart from seeing the restoration between the individual planks, those dark lines, sort of that you can sort of see, you can also sort of see that they turned upside down the large plank in the Botticelli's on top and in the Lippi at the bottom. The first point that can be established is that materials and the techniques of the initial planning stages are consistent in both panels, which indicates that they have been created at the same time in the same studio. The figures have been applied freehand in a liquid medium with broad different size brushstrokes, and the architecture has been incised with the help of stylus, compass, and ruler. The incision, when you go in the exhibition, can very clearly be seen also on the sort of painted sort of surface. The drawing in both panels is remarkably free and loose, with a number of changes and adjustments throughout the design and painting processes, indicating that the creative process was in constant movement, while the space in which the figures are positioned were reserved, meaning that the architecture was incised and then painted around these void spaces that were reserved for the figures. They are not always followed sort of in the painting stage, and especially not by Lippi. Often the figure expand outside the reverse lines and also cover part of the incision lines. The second point that can be recognized is that while technique and materials in both panels are consistent, the use of these techniques is a different one. The panel we attribute to Botticelli shows a much more controlled handling of the design drawing. Creative decisions within the figures are still made during the painting stages, but there is a much more rigid approach in the earlier planning stage. The visible underdrawings that we find in the panel attributed to Filippino, on the other hand, are wild and exuberant, with the use of different sized brushes. Lippi's figure also encroached far beyond the reserves, covering the background paint of the architecture, whereas Botticelli stays mostly within the lines. In the Lippi panel, the architectural framework is also treated more intuitively, and the incised lines are less closely followed. We have that, the Este panels, for example, have also a slightly different treatment of the architecture. Here, the lines are quite precise, but they're not necessarily always followed in the Lippi panel with the paint, sort of the incisions. Well, but from here on, my talk will now turn into a Son et Lumière show, presenting you with a number of slides with details of the infrared reflectograms of both panels to illustrate the above remarks more clearly, and also because I think to understand the collaboration of a Florentine workshop needs a collaboration of art historians and people at an event like this. So here goes. There's a detail of the first figure in each panel, the Persian Sibyl in Botticelli and the Samian Sibyl in Lippi, with the different approaches to the drawings are clearly visible, the different techniques. Equally, here in the lower body, in the you can hear, equally in the lower bodies, in the Libyan, the second sort of Botticelli sort of Sibyl, and the Phrygian, the fourth sort of Sibyl by sort of Lippi. Both images show loose underdrawing. You have to adjust your eyes a little more for the for the Botticelli because they're much finer lines usually, but these sort of little hooks that he does are all there. Both images show loose underdrawing that indicate the legs beneath the drapery. In the Libyan sort of Sibyl, this is only hinted at. Sort of the left leg, with most of the lines ending in loops denotating the folds in the drapery, and the paint is kept within the reserve, whereas Lippi generously overpaints the architecture. Sort of you can sort of see after the leg, then into the roundel, sort of going down. Details of the feet of the Eritrean, the last Botticelli sort of Sibyl, and the Samian, the first Sibyl, show changes in the foot position, free, and in the case sort of the Samian, almost impatiently made. And you can also sort of there, again, sort of look a little behind them, you sort of can see the incised lines and how they have been treated differently, and they're much more lining and sort of planning and programming and precision in Botticelli. So both panels here show the the Botticelli and the Lippi panels sort of show incised lines used to denote the architecture and to establish the perspective. But as I said, Botticelli's incising is more complex and precise, following continuous lines with, for example, also an additional vertical line behind the pillar that you can see sort of there on the left, and then the longer lines, really practicing lines in sort of in there, and here, then sort of in the next one, sort of again a much more complicated sort of incising at the left, also with radiating lines to position the column, sort of with a clear indication of the use of the compass. There's a little hole in the middle of that crossing, sort of there. The fourth column in Botticelli also has, but that's the only middle line that we find in Botticelli, a vertical line, sort of to position the column in the middle. But returning to the figures, here we go back to Botticelli's Persian Sibyl. The simple linear liquid drawing becomes visible and is clearly visible. There are small changes to the contour of the head and in a thicker line to the contour of the breast. And the forehead of the Sibyl, the background paint appears to encroach beneath the reverse of the figure. The idea that the face has been made a little sort of thinner might have something to do with that encroaching darkness of the underpaint, but they could also sort of have painted over that. But the thicker and livelier brushstrokes that are prevailing in the Lippi panel also appear here. You can see sort of at the bottom sort of some of the thicker brushstrokes sort of there, and also sort of around the breast. It's a slightly different line. Probably the most dramatic Pentimentian adjustments from the underdrawing stage to the painted stage are the changes in the head position and the different direction of the gaze in Botticelli's Libyan Sibyl, with some hair ringlets visible on her temple, sort of there on the left. The headdress also seems to be added later in the process and has been partially painted over sort of the architecture and the incision lines. And you can again sort of see there at the top how that changes. Equally, we find this sort of line in this, again, sort of Botticelli in the Delphic Sibyl, the central figure of the Botticelli paintings. The central figure in Lippi's painting, the Hellespontic, sort of now we're back with the Delphic sort of, and yeah, I'm almost done, just running through the, here the Hellespontic, the figure, sort of that is the middle figure of the, sort of Lippi panel. And again, sort of the Hellespontic Sibyl shows, in contrast to the Lippi panels, broad, sketchy underdrawings with areas of wash briefly describing the legs beneath, which were never intended to be followed in the actual painting. More care and precisions were given to the belt and the drapery in the middle part of the figure, while also not precisely followed in the painting. The lines are much more sensitively and purposefully drawn. Here too, though, the painted drapery is encroaching broadly over the architecture in many places. The many changes from early design stage to underdrawing to painting suggest that the design for this figure was only very loosely fixed prior to painting. The Phrygian sort of Sibyl also shows the loose drawing with wide, quick brushstrokes indicating the feet and legs under the drapery, but being even broader and more schematic, especially the figure's right hand is just indicated. You can sort of see there with an oval, almost like a mitten. In the head, sort of there again, the lay-in for the background encroaches beneath the face and shoulders, and the painted drapery spills out over the architecture, indicating, again, the fluidity of the painting process. The same observations can be made in Lippi's end figure, the Tiburtine Sibyl. The figure is again only loosely reserved and designed with fast and vigorous free hand brushstrokes of different width, and describing the legs and possibly breasts under the drapery. There is some uncertainty in the design where the figure gathers the drapery, and there's a square, sort of that you can sort of see sort of there, and the shape is unclear. It might have been a book, but as I say, it was very clear that they should not have any sort of attributes in the painting. And again, the painting of the drapery extends over the architecture and the incision lines. Here you can sort of see the arm, and sort of at the bottom the drapery, and this idea that you sort of saw in the panels, that the figures, the Lippi figures, are a little in front of the niches, sort of comes from this not painting within these reserves, within the lines that were left for the figures. Well, after this very quick run through of the images, which I hope will add a substantial amount of data, first of all, to our understanding of Botticelli's workshop practice and design processes, I do think we will have to spend much more time digesting it, and this exhibition is a momentous starting point in discussing how processes work, how workshops work, and especially, of course, Botticelli's workshop, and attributions, authorship, I mean, all these sort of questions. The complexity of Botticelli's workshop practice has already been observed by Jill Dunkerton and Rachel Billinch when examining the Adoration of the Magi at the National Gallery, another collaborative work between Botticelli and Filippino. The unconventional and diverse workshop methods, which are visible in these underdrawings, and several others by Botticelli and his workshop, are also incorporated in the important points made in the essay by Cecilia Frossinini in the exhibition catalogue about the examination of underdrawings. And while there are similarities in the infrared findings among the group of paintings usually regarded as collaborations between Botticelli and the younger associate Filippino, there also remain differences and contradictions. These are due to the ever-changing developments, adjustments, and learning in a busy and successful workshop environment like Botticelli's, Methods seem to have been fluid and artists learned from each other, as Michelle O'Malley again, and I'm very much looking forward to that talk, has impressively shown in her research on the Botticelli workshop. The Sybil panels, therefore, are just one part in this process, but a very important part that has been, I think, too marginalized and that will have to take its position as a central piece in the research on Botticelli and Filippino's artistic relationship and the understanding of Botticelli's workshop practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for this beautiful talk, and thanks for the loan, of course, of the fantastic paintings. So we're taking a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back with Emanuele Lugli's lecture on Botticelli's hair, which is very cool, and then we'll take all the questions at the end of the day. So see you in 15 minutes at 2:35. 2:35. Thank you.
hidden from light, and whose vibrancy photographs cannot quite capture. And so we recalibrate our ideas about Botticelli's process and perhaps even make some discoveries. Furio has actually made one such discovery. He attributed this drawing to Botticelli. For over a century, we have been unreasonably tentative about its authorship because we couldn't quite understand its relationship to a painting today in Germany, possibly a portrait of Simonetta Vespucci, one of the most beautiful women of Florence. Art historians like myself could not understand the relationship because the drawing does not include many elements of the painting, such as the braids meeting at the chest and the necklace. These are the elements that we mostly focused on, and so they could not have been omitted if this drawing were a record of the painting. But these elements were also too important to be forgotten in a preparatory drawing. Ridiculous, Furio tells us. All of these hesitations are out of place. The drawing, with its highlights and hatching, is perfectly in line with Botticelli's production. Botticelli simply made some changes to the panel while working on it. He added the necklace, the braids, no big deal. As Furio once told me, paintings can be messy. They are made of layers, added at different times, and may involve different hands. As the last section of this show makes clear, Botticelli was particularly accepting of his assistant's interventions, which did not disqualify a work as his own. But drawings are different than painting. They show artistic thinking in a purer, more intimate state. So in this drawing, we can see what Botticelli was thinking about. He did not care, at the start at least, about the necklace, nor the feathers on the top, nor the outfit. Instead, he cared about the profile, the chiseled nose and the protruding chin, and he also cared about the hair. Botticelli rendered its undulating strands with the precision of the eye. This is unusual. Why? Renaissance artists actually thought a great deal about hair. It wasn't just them. Many people across Italy did at the time. Their hair served as a key biological and social differentiator. Doctors asserted that the difference between a man and a woman could be seen in their hair. They must have repeated it quite often, for the definition appears in most university textbooks. I cite from one of them, called Pantegni, which states that the key distinctions between men and women, namely that the body of man is hotter and drier, which is a way to say stronger, while the body of women is colder and richer in moisture, which is a way to say weaker, right, is demonstrated by their hair. Another text made a distinction between the hair of men, referred to in Latin as capilli, and that of women, called crines, a term that was also used to describe the fur of animals, an association that should not go unnoticed. This classification portrayed women's hair and animal pelt as thicker and longer, providing evidence of biological weakness, a notion reinforced by the consideration of hair as natural waste. Physicians regarded hair as an excess in digestion. They learned that the substances not digested or expelled through defecation formed a kind of viscous cloud that rose through the body until it reached the scalp, where, fanned by the coldness of the brain, a sort of AC system, it went through the pores, becoming progressively drier and piling up to give form to the dead filaments that we call hair. So hair was not just the leftovers of the leftovers, it was also dried up, that is, dead, a classification we still use today, by the way. It was both something that your body tried to get rid of, but at the same time got stuck to it, like a dead appendage no one knows what to do with. Hair was the ultimate case of pointlessness, and thus it was called superfluous or superfluitas in Latin, because all these texts are in Latin. This categorization carried a moral dimension. Hair was not just unnecessary, it was the source of vice. Nuns got rid of it and shaved it off. However, secular women were forbidden to get rid of it. The Pope stated clearly in a bull of 1479, quickly popularized by the most popular companion to canon law, which you can see here on the screen, from 1484, where women were prohibited from cutting their hair over their shoulders. Local legislations echoed this sentiment, stating that young women had to wear their hair long to veil their body, an idea that originated from St. Paul, and then veiled it after getting married. You can see the difference in these details of a painting by Botticelli, where an unmarried woman is shielded by her older relatives, all of whom are veiled. The veiling was a sign of modesty towards God, a symbol of subordination to women's husbands, but also a safety measure, since women's hair was one of the most eroticized parts of a woman's body, which was covered and largely invisible to men. In a successful novel titled The Golden Ass, about a man full of vices who is punished by being transformed into a donkey only to realize his vices, give them up, and become a monk, the protagonist, Lucius, considers hair the first and ultimate delight. As to the rest of a woman's body, he writes, the novel is in the first person, "I've nothing to say. It's only a woman's head and her hair that I'm really interested in. It's what I like to feast my eyes on, first in the street, then enjoy it in the private indoors," end quote. He goes on in a sort of delirious monologue that inspired Vladimir Nabokov when writing Lolita. This is one of the many paradoxes of the Renaissance. Women's hair was both a means of subjugation, the very misogynistic tool used to convince women of their own inferiority, and at the same time, the ultimate erotic pleasure, something that even women took pride in. In Botticelli's Florence, hair took on the same constricting pleasures produced by the corset in 19th century France and the stiletto in 1950s LA. But a woman rarely let her hair loose, at least during her public outings, which usually meant on her way to the church. A woman was instructed to take care of her hair daily. Today we call it styling, but it was more like a form of policing in its original sense of polizia, hence the term police. Right? The effect of both cleaning, cleansing, and disciplining comes at two sides: a row of fine teeth to remove dirt, and a row of wider teeth to turn the mass of hair into strands and help with the braiding, that is to control the hair formally. If unkept hair was considered disgusting and loose tresses were deemed lustful, a neat hairstyle was instead praised as an expression of beauty. Hair stylings, or better, hair policing, was the venue where a woman showed off her compliance with the social norms dictated by men, and thus her contribution to civility. Botticelli was acutely aware of all of this. Preacher denounced hair as the tools of the devil, and on the pulpit of San Lorenzo in Florence, he could see a demon holding onto the hair of the thief destined to be cast into hell. He saw depictions of the vainest man who ever existed, Absalom, being killed, his hair caught in the branches of a tree, all because he refused to wear a helmet that would squash and hide the hair of which he was so proud. Botticelli studied Donatello's sculptures of Judith and Holofernes, where the Jewish heroine is the embodiment of virtue, her head veiled, her body covered up, her wrists, while he's a hairy mess. Tufts erupting from his chest and armpits, mustaches falling from his cheeks. She even holds him by the hair, a classical symbol of dominance, but also an indication of Holofernes' lustful character. Botticelli himself relied on the gesture for an allegory whose meaning still puzzles scholars, who however concur on one thing. The centaur is a beast out of control, and the proper goddess, with her neatly combed mane, shows some sort of rational superiority by taming its wildest impulses. These artworks speak of hair as a source of danger, something in need of control. Women did so mostly by compacting it. After washing, drying, and anointing her long hair, a Renaissance woman combed it and pulled it to the back, where she gathered in a long braid. She tightened it with a ribbon that spiraled all around. In Milan, They left it like that, pasting gum to the front locks and covering with a net, as you can see on the left. Oh, I'm sorry, on the right. But in Florence, women coiled the pleat around their head or on its back, fastening with pins and tucking its end somewhere. They may have pulled a ribbon or two across the whole bundles, and for special occasions, decorated the whole things with sparkling brooches and by draping strings of pearls, as you can see in these beautiful drawings by Pollaiuolo. As the writer Carlo Alberti confessed a generation before Botticelli, only a small deliberate negligence when styling hair was allowed, as a way to make her beauty, that is her order, more patent. And the emphasis here is on small and deliberate. And so, after compacting and securing their hair, Florentine women loosened it up a little and pulled a few locks out, crimping them sometimes. In these exhibitions, we have a beautiful example of this process in Botticelli's portrait from Altenburg, where you can see both the severely parted and combed hair at the base, and then this gorgeous patch of curls at the front. Botticelli paints every hair with tremendous attention, but also shows little bits of leather strings holding the structures together. It's a detail that reveals the complex structure that makes this cloud of hair stands out. Perhaps even an attempt to make an artificial toupee pass as real. We have a portrait by Domenico Ghirlandaio here in California that shows a similar hairstyle, but in this portrait, the patch of hair looks as if it were pinned to the side, which posed a risk. Moralists heavily criticize wigs and extensions, which they associated with illusions and witchcraft. Usually, it is easier to appreciate Renaissance hairstyling through sculpture, as many Florentine women wore their hair asymmetrically, with the hands of their braids hanging on one side. The bust you see here is by Desiderio da Settignano, an incredible sculptor who died around the age of 35, but was among the first artists to showcase the plastic inventiveness of hair. He often put hair to dramatic use, like in this bust of a child, perhaps Christ, where the curl on the forehead steals the attention. In this respect, however, Simonetta's portrait is a class of its own, for Botticelli comes up with an incredible idea when styling hair. The head is draped in a string of pearls, whose exorbitant number, I count over 200, is in line with the most extravagant events of the Florentine elite. Knights and their ladies sporting outfits and headgear encrusted with pearls. The styling of Botticelli's sides, however, is unusual. 3 braids are laid over the head and erupt into what looks like enormous tassels. Voluminous and wavy, they are shaped in the way Botticelli usually paints flames. You see one in the upside-down arrow tip of Cupid in Botticelli's famous Primavera. Cupid, let me rotate the painting to its proper orientation, is about to strike one of the Graces, the one who is looking at the man on the far left, her tunic coming undone to reveal her heart to him. Though his gaze is averted, in her eyes and ours, he burns with the flames of love. You see the pattern of inverted flames on his tunic? These are multiplications of Cupid upside-down flame, for love was thought to descend from the heavens. I find these juxtapositions exhilarating, for it makes me wonder if Simonetta's tufts of hair are also a way to denote that she's both an object of desire and spring to love. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence that defines love as seeing fire. Dante wrote that love behaves like a blaze. It starts with a glance, which is a spark, but soon burns everything down, leaving no place to hide. Lorenzo de' Medici, who was not just a politician but an accomplished poet, thought of lovers as burning men. He wrote that when looking at a woman, his heart was surrounded by so many flames that it seems to him impossible to tolerate the breathlessness caused by his blazing desire. In his poem titled Triumph of Love, Petrarch describes the ardor of passion in great detail. He writes that Cupid's arrows pierce through the flesh and hit people's bones, which, due to their dryness, catch fire instantly. Botticelli drew the Triumph of Love for a manuscript here in the show. Following Petrarch's descriptions, he had Cupid standing on a float shaped like a blazing fountain, pulled by horses running like mad. Around the same time, one of Florence's most in-demand illuminators, Ricciardo di Nanni, painted the same subject, but he overemphasized its fiery dimension. He placed Cupid among bowmen, ready to release arrows whose tips burn with enormous flames. They sit around two female busts whose back braids intertwine, forming two torches that serve as the platform for the god of love. Above and below, Putti's heads are literally on fire. Christian preachers saw the fire of lust as the ultimate goal of hairdressing. They shouted that with their elaborate hairstyling, women, and I quote, wish to inflame men and have sex with them, end quote. Those are blunt words. The secular poetry of the time chose softer tones that, however, hardly tempered such a view. A key passage in this respect is from Angelo Poliziano, a wondrously influential writer working for Lorenzo de' Medici. In a poem, he describes that we are staring at a woman who is not looking at us, and Cupid hides inside her eye and pulls her ocular nerve as if it were a bowstring to release an arrow of fire that enters our eyes so that we feel a fire spreading in our heart. What is Botticelli's painting if not a visualization of this process? Cupid's arrow has hit us. So when we look at the woman, we don't just see her, but we also see the flames that consume our heart. That is the degree of cultural inventiveness that we can anticipate from Botticelli, hailed as a very clever man in his times. And it is an idea he cultivated from the outset, as evidenced by the beautiful drawing featured in this show. This instance is also not the sole occasion where Botticelli employed her to control our reactions, and an equally prodigious undertaking is evident in his famous Venus. The painting is structured from left to right. Venus is not coming from far away towards us. She's being pushed by the winds to the seashore, where a nymph is about to clothe her. Scholars have spent a great deal of time trying to find the sources of this painting, literary sources that is. Some aspects recall Ovid's Metamorphoses, others an obscure Greek hymn to Venus that some intellectuals knew. While all these literary sources are useful, they are pretty conventional when it comes to hair. They speak of billowing tresses, moved by the wind, resplendent in the sunlight. But Venus' stupendously detailed jellyfish-like hair is nothing but conventional. It's one of the focuses of the painting. Loose flowing hair was a feature of divinities or allegories, eternally young creatures who embody the freedom and power that women so often did not have. Botticelli could see an example in the Bondas by Donatello, a statue towering over a column in the main market square of Florence. The statue is lost. What you see on screen is a reproduction. But Botticelli, who lived at the western margin of Florence, had to see it daily to go pretty much anywhere. He even left a sketch with his own version of it. Yet, I see the hair of Venus as wilder and more exciting than that of Abundance. No brooch, no braid. The ribbon in the back is coming loose and falling off. And I think that Botticelli took a specific object as the prototype for this freedom. Known to specialists today as the Farnese cup, that vessel of classical origin was among the most treasured antiquities in the collections of Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo received it from the Pope at his first embassy in Rome and kept it in his study room, showing only to those, I quote, who were able to appreciate it, his words, end quote, that his people like the King of Naples. He also showed it to the artists he trusted, and Botticelli must have been among them. On the inside, what you see right now, you're facing the cup from the very top, right, are a few figures carved out of a thin white vein so that they stand out against the marble ground. No one knew what they represented. We still don't know. But ignorance did not deter Botticelli, for he took the two flying figures as prototypes for his wings. Yet, no one seems to have noticed that Botticelli also studied the exteriors of the cup. It displayed the magnetic face of Medusa against the goat skin of Athena's Aegis, her hair frozen in mid-explosion. Botticelli studied attentively. He marveled at the bending of the curves, the flashes of white produced by the glittering of the incisions. He noticed that the carver made locks of hair move to the front and the back, like the lattice on a pie, and then translated all of this to the fluttering tresses of his Venus. Now, what does it mean to give Venus the hair of Medusa? When we think of Medusa, we often envision a terrifying mane of snakes. But Botticelli was given a different story, a different version of her story. He read in Ovid and Boccaccio and other texts that Medusa was a beautiful semi-goddess with the most incredible hair. Because of her hair and her hair alone, Neptune fell in love with her, and the two had sex in the temple of Minerva, who, horrified, decided to transform Medusa's most enticing feature into snakes. A collaborator of Botticelli, Cristoforo Landino, about whom we'll hear more in a minute from Patricia Rubin, transcribed this version of Medusa's story in his commentary on Dante's Inferno, a publication that Botticelli illustrated. And there, Landino wrote that Minerva's transformations of Medusa's hair was morally justifiable, as it served to expose Medusa's lust. In other words, it was Medusa who started it. By taking pride in her hair, that is, by just displaying it, she bewitched poor old Neptune. This text is enough to show Venus in a different light. She's not just the solar, beautiful embodiment of fertility, but like countless medieval poems already said, there is something more sinister spreading from her. And this is made clear by her fluttering hair, which, by the way, Botticelli could also see in the Sphinxes, the Desiderio da Settignano, the sculpture of the boy with a curl on his forehead, carved at the corners of a tomb in Florence. The Sphinx, a monster with a woman's head, was a symbol of both wisdom and lust. Their loose hair was a way to stress their enigmatic power, extraneous to any morals. From the Sphinx, wild hair became a feature of femme fatale, especially when painted naked, like Olympias, the bloody and manipulating mother of Alexander the Great. This hair then acquired a menacing role when stuck on a naked body. And this is particularly the case when Botticelli chose a specific type of body. Scholars often call his Venus a Venus pudica, the modest Venus, because she's covering her genitals. And many artists, from Giovanni Pisano, from the pulpit of the Cathedral in Pisa, where Botticelli worked, to Masaccio in Florence, relied on this position to represent modesty, or even ashamed of being naked in front of God. But in Botticelli's time, this body was rediscovered as belonging to one of the most sculptures of antiquity, the Aphrodite that the great sculptor Praxiteles sold to the inhabitants of the city of Knidos. This statue generated a massive cult because it was the very first representation of a female nude. Historians tell us that the inhabitant promoted the cult of the statue by spreading all sorts of rumors about it. The most amazing is that you could fall in love with the statue the moment you saw it. Pliny writes about it, as do many other writers. A skeptic, sometimes identified with the great Greek writer Lucian, or one of his students, decided to see this for himself. He took 2 traveler companions and set sail to Knidos. He described how, upon arrival, all sorts of potters tried to sell souvenirs of the statue. He complained that their guide would not stop rhapsodizing about the statue's beauty, even mentioning King Nicomedes of Bithynia's offer to clear the city's public debt just to own the statue. The traveler and his friends make fun of the stupidity of humans. But then, when they get to the temple and they see the statue, they are struck dumb. One of the 2 friends surprised himself by shouting appreciations like a horny man. The other one is moved to tears. They're utterly baffled. Did the magic work? This episode, contained in a book titled Erotis, was well known in the circle of the Medici. Poliziano, for instance, quoted extensively from it. He searched for ancient coins representing the Aphrodites of Knidos. Botticelli could see versions of the statue, especially during his trip to Rome in 1482, even if most of them were fragments, as shown in the sketchbook from Holkham Hall of the early 16th century, without arms and especially the head. So he did what a good image maker does. He took the body and merged it with an equally bewitching head that are the features of an idealized beauty and the hair of Medusa and sphinxes and seductresses. The striking result is the most powerful body, a sort of chimera whose force has unfortunately been dulled by the use of the painting in countless advertisements. But Botticelli's operation is bold. If in his portrait of Simonetta, he used hair to suggest the flames that one feels when encountering transformative beauty, in the Venus, he presents her with the most bewitching hairstyle he could think of, so that, like the skeptical travelers to the temple of Knidos, we can only fall in love with the goddess of foresight. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuele, for such a dynamic and erudite presentation. I cannot recommend these books more. And we are on to, I think we need to, all right, to Michelle O'Malley, who is Professor Emerita in Renaissance Art History at the University of London and former Deputy Director of the Warburg Institute in London. She is the author of some of the classics in the field of Renaissance studies, including The Business of Art, published by Yale in 2005, and Painting Under Pressure, also from Yale 2013. She wrote many articles on the economics and production in Italian Renaissance workshops. Recently, she was a scholar in residence at the Dutch Institute of Art in Florence, and also she held a fellowship at the National Humanity Center in North Carolina. So please welcome Michelle O'Malley. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Furio, for that kind introduction and for such a beautiful exhibition. In the next few minutes, we will look at some of the drawings Botticelli made in the process of defining his painted compositions. Called underdrawings, they're hidden because they were made on the white primer of his painting supports and are covered by the paint layer of his pictures. As Cecilia Frosinini notes in the exhibition catalog, each underdrawing is a step in Botticelli's thinking about a particular work that is beyond the ideas of the studies he typically made on paper in developing new works, studies that form the basis of this exhibition. Underdrawings are revealed by sophisticated infrared technology. It is not a perfect system. Certain pigments cannot be penetrated by infrared rays, and some images made with older cameras are less clear than others. But over the years, the technology has revealed results that have changed our understanding about certain works of art and their authors. It is clear, for example, that in autograph freehand underdrawings, Botticelli almost always reevaluated and refined his forms. The autograph underdrawing of the Chigi Madonna, for example, is composed of fine, repetitive lines. It suggests that the child was originally placed across the Virgin's body. You can see that line there, and that's his head. But Botticelli changed this to a more traditional pose, with the child seated on the Virgin's lap. He also altered the poses of the heads and some of the features of the Virgin and Child to get their placement right. The Virgin's head was lowered. You can see, I hope, her higher features here. There's an eye and her higher chin. And the child's head was enlarged. In the Birth of Venus underdrawing, we can observe Botticelli rethinking form partly to mimic the natural world. First, he lightly transferred his design. Then he began fine-tuning. He puffed out the cheeks of the male wind and varied his fingers. He raised Venus's eye, moved her breasts, and lightly underpainted her hair, which we've just heard so much about and so instructively, flying out on both sides of her face. But at some point, Botticelli realized that he was not properly depicting how the wind operates. He altered Venus's hair to blow only one way and changed the collar of the cloak to be pushed back by the wind's force. Botticelli rethought design at the underdrawing stage for just about every commissioned painting he produced throughout his career. Such works of art were often for elite clients and intended for public or semi-public spaces. Until the 16th century, they were produced with a high degree of input by Botticelli. He was involved in every stage of their production. But commissioned works were only part of the outputs of a painter's business. Another category of paintings commonly gets little attention, although it was also central to Botticelli's business. These pictures were not commissioned, but made for speculative sale, generally to merchant and artisanal buyers. They were destined for domestic spaces and produced with a high degree of input by Botticelli's workshop assistants. While such paintings conformed to master painters' designs, they were typically underdrawn and painted by apprentices. I mean pictures that look like this, and this, and this, and many more. The system of production for both markets, commission and speculative sale, was necessarily crucial because speculative sale pictures were bound up with the painter's reputation and thus the strength of his demand, as much as commissioned works were, but they were mainly not produced by the master. So how was their production managed? While we have no written records of how master painters oversaw their assistants on a day-to-day basis, the information is embedded in the works of art themselves. We will look particularly now at three categories of underdrawing: those made with cartoons, those made with freehand transfer of Botticelli's designs, and those that are imitations of the master's designs. With this material, I want to make three arguments about Botticelli's business. The first is its practical organization. The underdrawings show Botticelli's facility for pragmatism. Over the course of his career, he employed a variety of reproduction techniques to orchestrate and use the skills of his assistants. The second concerns the business's structure. The underdrawings emphasize the high degree of agency in the production process that Botticelli came to give his assistants, much more responsibility for composition than we commonly recognize for Renaissance painters. The third is economic. The number of paintings largely made by Botticelli's assistants point to high demand for these works, and Botticelli's early use of reproductive methods in production suggests that he enjoyed this demand right from the earliest years of his career. Let's begin with cartoons. Cartoons are full-scale drawings of a painting subject, made to perfect a design and then to transfer it. Often, as in this drawing by Verrocchio, their outlines were pricked through to another piece of paper, making a porous copy of the drawing that was then placed onto the painting support and rubbed over with charcoal dust. The dots transferred through the little holes to the support were joined up into lines with either a dry medium or a brush and wet medium to complete the drawing of the image. Are you with me on this? Good, okay. Cartoons could be used to produce multiple works. They maintained a consistent standard of design across pictures. Few cartoons on paper survive, like this one. But we can tell that cartoons were used when underdrawings look like this one of the Madonna and Child with an Adoring Angel at the Art Institute in Chicago. Here, the smooth, unwavering lines make the transfer technique clear. These lines differ dramatically in character from the numerous wavering lines of freehand drawing that Botticelli used, for example, in the Chigi Madonna. And I hope you can see the difference in the character of the lines in these details of the Christ child's head. So we have the the head made with a cartoon and the head made with freehand drawing. Botticelli was at the forefront of cartoon use for panel paintings, and he probably engaged personally with the cartoon transfer process in his earliest pictures. Cartoons can be traced in two intriguing pairs of Botticelli's early works, the Madonna and Child with an Adoring Angel in Pasadena and Chicago, as we've just seen, and the Madonna and Child with St. John in the Louvre and a private collection. The Louvre's painting is in the exhibition. Botticelli conceived both sets of paintings to build up stock in images of the Madonna and Child with tenderly inclined heads. Both sets may have been conceived as parts of a series similar to the Madonna della Loggia, probably painted in the late 1460s, so before the other two were made. To discuss this, I'm going to start with an image of an underdrawing that, for copyright reasons, will only be seen by those in the auditorium. I'm sorry that this is not available to the online audience, and I would ask those of you who are taking photographs, please not to. Okay, here we go. The concept of the pictures of the Madonna and Child with St. John began with the Virgin's face in a three-quarter view, as it appears in the Madonna della Loggia in the Pasadena and Chicago pictures. And if you can see it, here's the outline of the cheek, the mouth, the nose, the eyes. The child's head was originally higher as well. After the transfer of the design, however, the Virgin's face was changed to a near-profile view, very like this study in Oxford, which Furio has identified and included in the exhibition. Though the lines in the infrared do not read as dark and firm as those in the Chicago picture do, cartoons were certainly involved in making both Madonna and Child with St. John paintings because the individual figures of the two works align. We can tell this by tracing the figures. The Pasadena and Chicago pictures also began like the Uffizi picture, with only two figures. In both paintings, the angel was added after the architecture was ruled and underpainted, and I think that's probably clear here. The child's reaching back leg was accordingly moved to the Virgin's lap. The outline of the leg, which you can see only in the Chicago picture very clearly, comes down here. Can you see that? And then there are little toes down here on the parapet. Other changes included moving down the Virgin's head and rotating, you can see it much more clearly in the detail. Other changes included moving down the Virgin's head and rotating the child's face. Here are the Virgin's higher eyes, higher mouth, higher chin. In the Chicago picture, the changes are more difficult to see in the older infrared image of the Pasadena picture, but the two chins are clear. For example, you see one chin here and a second chin here, and here is the inner alia of a higher eye on the child. I don't really mean alia, I mean just the inside of the eye. The changes were all made by moving cartoons. Once a cartoon was moved in one picture, it then had to be moved in the other. Although dating series of pictures can be especially tricky, most scholars date all four pictures early in Botticelli's career, around 1470 or sometimes earlier. That date means they are likely to reflect his own experimentation with cartoons. It is especially likely that Botticelli transferred the cartoons because the pictures introduce alterations, and those alterations conform in nature to the kinds of refinements found in paintings widely accepted as autograph, like the Chigi altarpiece and the Birth of Venus. Such changes are traceable in almost all of Botticelli's known underdrawings for largely autograph paintings. Conversely, they are rarely found in designs in pictures painted by assistants. It looks like Botticelli probably began using the cartoon technique specifically to produce works in series, and maybe to speed up their production. Soon after, he used cartoons also to control the designs of paintings transferred and painted by assistants, such as these three. We know of cartoon use in the Dresden and Frankfurt images because the figures perfectly align. Portions of the version in Florence also line up with those pictures, though. For example, the Florentine Virgin's lower face matches Dresden and Frankfurt. Oops. As do her arm and hand, but only if the Frankfurt underdrawing is angled, first one way to make the lower face line up on that side, and then the other way, and when you move it far enough, the hands click together, as it were. You can see that they reproduce each other. This, in particular, makes it clear that some of Botticelli's cartoons were for parts of figures and might be placed individually to make similar pictures. They suggest an approach to picture making that is richer and more versatile than we normally recognize. While cartoons demonstrate management methods, they also underline demand. Painters only produced works in series because they could be sold. Botticelli's sets were almost certainly made for speculative sale because in Florence, clients rarely commissioned copies of paintings. The fact that these four are dated to around 1470 suggests that there was significant demand for this strand of his work exactly when Botticelli began to receive commissions. Surviving works demonstrate that the demand remained high throughout Botticelli's career. Maybe for this reason, and despite the efficacy of cartoons as a management tool, Botticelli more often used another method for organizing the production of images to be painted by his assistants. He made just designs on paper, which his assistants used as a guide to produce underdrawings freehand. In giving his assistants scope to make their own drawings, Botticelli was probably relying on a system of copying that Leonardo explained, in which apprentices learned to copy by eye, repeatedly drawing figures until they could make figures precisely like their models. The large group that demonstrates this is the panels of the Madonna and Child that are related to the main figures of the San Barnaba altarpiece. Here, the Virgin is depicted with her face inclined to the right and her left shoulder turned away from the viewer. She supports her child, who is leaning forward onto her right arm. The way the Virgin's body turns and her child leans must have been the details that most evoked the figures on this admired civic altarpiece. For none of the related paintings has figures on this has figures identical to those of the altarpiece, and in most cases, they're also unlike each other. The twist of the Virgin's body varies, the child takes different stances, and the backgrounds differ in different ways from the ecclesiastical niche of the altarpiece. Only one painting in this group, this now in a private collection, was made with a cartoon created for or taken from the altarpiece. Perhaps other paintings that do not survive were made from this cartoon. The version in the Harvard collections, however, was drawn freehand by an assistant, as were others in this group. Here, the Virgin stands and her child is more upright than he is in the altarpiece. All the drapery is simplified, and the background is completely different. Moreover, the Harvard underdrawing clearly shows certain problems of execution. The parapet is alarmingly out of perspective. The Virgin's neckline is clumsily delineated. The child's feet are too small, and his left arm is too thin and awkwardly joined to his body. You can see that better in the detail. The placement of the Virgin's left hand is too low to be anatomically correct, and her thumb is simply depicted as flat and parallel to the picture plane by the original draftsman. And can you see that down here? There's the thumb, and there's the thumb nail. After this underdrawing was made, a more experienced painter corrected its problems. He positioned the Virgin's left hand appropriately higher and in a more elegant pose, with the thumb drawn in perspective. He indicated folds of the Virgin's robe, put more flesh on the child's arm, enlarged his feet, corrected the parapet, and placed a wind instrument into the child's hand. We cannot be sure that this experienced artist was Botticelli. I hope you can see this here. It's a kind of recorder. We can't be sure that the artist was Botticelli, but we know that Botticelli was famous for joking around. He was perfectly capable of drawing silly images in the course of creating a design. This is clear in the underdrawing of the Piacenza Tondo, where a crudely drawn phallic image is visible near the Virgin's head, with little feet. The musical instrument may be the same kind of thing, made with some witty running commentary as Botticelli deftly corrected his assistant's drawing. The instrument, of course, was never meant to be seen, but to be covered by the paint layer of the picture. The corrections made to the Harvard underdrawing suggest the nature and level of the oversight that Botticelli might give to images whose design transfer and painting were accomplished by assistants. A second version of this picture, now in Turin, was almost certainly not made with a cartoon derived from the Harvard version. Interestingly, though, it incorporates the Harvard version's improvements and was also done by assistants, perhaps the same one. Over the course of his career, Botticelli relied more and more on assistants' skills for copying figures and inventing backgrounds. But he also, at least occasionally, reviewed their work or had a trusted senior collaborator do so to safeguard a certain level of quality in production. As Botticelli's career developed, he added to his methods of management by giving some assistants the autonomy to design de novo paintings that reproduced his highly recognizable figures. This manner of operation is represented by the way the Little Annunciation in Hanover, Germany, was fabricated. The design takes as models well-known figures Botticelli designed around 1490 for much larger panels: the Angel of the Cestello Annunciation and an adoring Virgin similar to the figure in the Tondo at the National Gallery of Art, Washington. The underdrawing was clearly made freehand by an assistant, but it is unlikely to have been made from a master drawing. The composition has a heavy, worked-over quality that appears to be the result of a less experienced painter working out how to depict certain aspects of the figures convincingly. But as Bastiano Eclerci notes, two elements here are remarkable. They emphasize the way good assistants were attentive to, and learned from, the practice of the master. The first is the way the painter made the archangel's hand align with the edge of an object in the background. Here it is a lectern, in the Cestello altarpiece it is a doorway. The second element is the way the painter changed the Virgin's face in the course of creating the design. He first depicted the face as turned out toward the viewer, somewhat like that in the Washington Tondo. And again, I hope you can see the edge of the Virgin's cheek, the mouth, the nose, and the eyes. Later, the assistant redrew the face in a long horizontal profile that very strongly resembles the face of the Virgin of the Mystic Nativity. The alterations suggest that the Annunciation was underway as Botticelli worked on the Mystic Nativity nearby. The painter was both alert and creative. The Hanover picture demonstrates the dynamic process of exchange that pertained between Botticelli and his assistants. This cannot have been unusual. Good assistants must always have been closely attuned to their master's ideas and methods of making. Indeed, the master taught by his own example of working as much as by creating copyable designs and overseeing drawing. For Botticelli, that teaching included his rethinking form, even as he finalized an underdrawing on panel. Here, we have a chance to glimpse a moment of assistant attentiveness in action. Significantly, the Hanover picture was a commission. The praying figure makes this clear. Botticelli's system of management means the client of this small, private picture received an injection of Botticelli's most up-to-the-minute design ideas in a panel composed and painted by his assistant. To conclude, Botticelli's career is remarkable for forging systems of production that employed the talents and skills of his assistants. He embraced the new technology of cartoon use for panel painting, but also made designs of figure compositions specifically for freehand transfer by his assistants. And he allowed particularly skilled assistants to work up designs based on his recognizable figure types. Scholars would like paintings to fall into neat categories, those created solely by a master or those made only by an assistant. But the workshop did not operate that way. Production was fluid and, crucially, practical. Botticelli deployed his workforce as it was needed to bring out the work. This meant Botticelli's assistants often operated with a level of agency we don't normally expect in our conception of workshop operation. Botticelli's pragmatic, adaptable approach to production offers a glimpse of how the workshops of other painters might also have been managed to meet the many outputs required of a master painter in late 15th century Florence. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for the really brilliant observations and the fantastic images that you illustrated. Here we are, the last one. Patricia L. Rubin is a professor emerita of Renaissance art at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York. She has served as director of that institute, in addition to deputy director of the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and the founding head of the Courtauld Institute Research Forum. She was also the acting director at Villa I Tatti in Florence, the Harvard Center for Renaissance Studies. She has taught courses and published articles on the practice of drawing and painting in Renaissance Italy. She also researched on art and society in Renaissance Florence. Her book, Image and Identity in 15th Century Florence, is another classic in the field. She has also curated a memorable exhibition at the National Gallery in London, Renaissance Florence, the Art of the 1470s, which I have extensively quoted in the Botticelli catalog. Also, Pat was kind enough to read my essay a year ago, and she begged me to take out some things, which I diligently did. And thank you so much for being with us, and please welcome Pat Rubin. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, which did make me sound a bit like that devil with the sword. However, I am delighted that the Legion of Honor invited me to speak today about Sandro Botticelli's envisioning of Dante Alighieri's visionary poem, because it gives me the chance to share in congratulating the exhibition's curator, Furio, the director Tom Campbell, the museum staff, on all of those enlightened institutions and supporters who's of that vision and made it possible for us to experience the divine artistry of Botticelli, which is also at times, as we've already seen, has its own commedia or comic elements involved in it. Let's see, is that, yes. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, Midway on our life's journey, I found myself in a dark woods, lost, having abandoned the true path. Thus the opening of the pilgrim Dante's journey from that fearful state to spiritual enlightenment, as written by the poet Dante, and here as designed by Botticelli for a printed edition of the poem. That epic itinerary is one from corporeal to contemplative vision. It is intensely visual, evoking what and how the protagonist sees as he progresses from witnessing the horrifying, virtually unbearable sights of hell to being exposed to the dazzling light of the heavens. On the left, Botticelli's depiction of Dante's encounter with one of the traitors frozen in the icy depths of hell, condemned eternally to dine on the brains of a fellow sinner. On the right, Dante in paradise, raising his eyes to heaven. These and the following details that I will show you are from drawings that are now in Berlin. In the course of that journey, the pilgrim Dante progresses from the repellent company of cruel and crudely behaved demons to that of the angelic host. Here, instances of those contrasting companions. On the right, angels of paradise, and on the left, the devil Barbarica escorting Dante and Virgil downwards from one circle of hell to the next, sounding a trumpet call from his ass, one of, I think, the few depictions of a fart in Renaissance art. Dante wrote the visionary tale from a variety of perspectives and in multiple registers, describing the traveler's encounters, quoting his conversations, and giving voice to his guides and mentors. The shade of the Roman poet Virgil, who became brings Dante safely through the Inferno and Purgatory, and to his beloved Beatrice, incarnation of divine love, who leads and lifts him from towards the eternal light of salvation. Here, Virgil protecting the terrified Dante from diabolical antics, and Beatrice and Dante in the sphere of the moon. The poet Dante, so one has to always distinguish a bit between the pilgrim Dante and the poet Dante. The poet Dante is also present throughout, reminding the reader both of the act of reading and the art of writing. Botticelli understood and adopted the poem's complex narrative structure in illustrating the Commedia. He was given two opportunities to do so. The first was providing designs to be engraved as forms of visual rubrics in a deluxe printed edition published in 1481. The second was to make drawings for full-page illuminations of a magnificent manuscript. And here I show you the illustrations to Inferno, the 18th canto of Inferno, from both. In both, you see the panderers, seducers, and flatterers forced to walk in circles while being whipped by demons. The context for both publications was the city's, Florence's posthumous reclaiming of the actually exiled Dante as a premier citizen in what was effectively a politics of Florentine cultural domination. The 1481 printed edition, with its commentary by the humanist Cristoforo Landino, was explicitly conceived to promote Dante as a Florentine luminary. And I show you the opening page. On the left, you see the opening page of that edition with Landino's long and celebratory of both Dante and of Florentine excellence. And on the right, the opening to the first canto of the Inferno with the illustration that had the engraving, which has also then been painted. Grandiose in format, the volume was further intended to prove Florentine preeminence in the relatively new inventions, and we have to remember this, we take them for granted, of both printing and pictorial engraving, leaving space, as you can see in this example, but a copy in the Rylands Library in Manchester, for more traditional forms of embellishment. It was a commercial venture undertaken by Landino in partnership with the printer and a financial sponsor. The commentary was a triumph for Landino. It became a standard work and is still cited today. Unfortunately, for the venture itself, the partners fell out and went to court. Never probably a very good idea for ventures. The dispute, along with the speed of publication and the eventual bankruptcy of the publisher, as I say, Landino did fine out of all this, there was 8 months were specified in the contract, meant that only 19 engravings were made for the Inferno, the first 18 cantos. Botticelli cannot be blamed for the shortfall, although tradition has oftenly given him the blame. It is unlikely that any designer, however perfunctory, could have devised the 100 new images required in the course of 8 months, and with other work going on, and with 3 presses running at once, and Landino was writing the commentary as the presses were running. So, this is kind of an impossible task. Botticelli, and that would be for a perfunctory designer who was just churning things out on the base of other models. Botticelli was never perfunctory, though he was by profession, or could be called a master of design, a maestro di disegno, which was a professional designation. That is an artist who was regularly called upon to produce drawings for execution by others. And we can even see that the model of using drawings for production by others was something that Mick has just shown us worked within his workshop management. Now, no drawings for the 1481 Dante survive. But even in their awkward execution and elaboration by the engravers, the extant images, and I think there was more than one engraver working on them, the extant images prove Botticelli's own immersion in the text. He had many ways to know the Commedia, and was possibly able to recall much of it by memory, something that Florentines at least could do well into the 20th century. Publicly recited and widely owned, even when book ownership was relatively rare and costly, it was by way of becoming proverbial. Dante says was itself a common saying, citing bits and pieces of the Commedia. So, alert to what Dante said about the treacherous spaces of hell, Botticelli abandoned the rational rules of perspective to capture Dante and Virgil's experience of their descent into the Inferno as far as its 8th circle in Canto 19, and that I show you on the left. And you can see it is without actual space. It's about a voyage into the depths. He also caught, and this I think is important throughout, the emotional tenor of the verses, both the infernal terrors and the tenderness of the pilgrim's guide. And the poet, the guide also, the poet Dante's avatar, Virgil, the Roman poet Virgil. With unprecedented originality, Botticelli embodied Dante's bewilderment and Virgil's instruction, as here on the right, showing Virgil describing the layout of hell before they go further down into that difficult and dangerous territory. I mean, he's showing you a conversation. Here, nor did Botticelli lose track of the journey that he had begun to map when he was able to resume it on an even grander scale. Here I show you the drawing for Canto 10, Canto 19 of the Inferno. But though I can show it to you, and I realize you're looking at something that is virtually invisible, that is because you were not meant to see it any more than the underdrawings that we have been looking at in the paintings, or really any of the others. It is a compositional underdrawing intended to be covered by color. And this way I show you a detail from that, as well as the same canto from the engraved series, so that you can see their relationship. So in the second, for example, and I show you also detail the flailing legs in both, central to the 1481 engraving, which had to be much more compressed, which are those of Pope Boniface VIII, whom Dante in the text chastises for his nepotism, which makes him wave his legs even more. The drawing is one of 92 parchment sheets, survivors of the originally planned illuminated manuscript of the Commedia. 85 of them, including the one for Canto 19, are in the Department of Prints and Drawings in the Berlin museums. The remaining survivors, the Chart of Hell, as I show you here, and 7 cantos from the Inferno are in the Vatican Library. A further 8 cantos of the Inferno are missing, and 2 with text for Paradise, formerly in Berlin, have disappeared. The first known mention of the work is in a collection of notes about Tuscan artists dating from the 1540s. It states that Botticelli painted and illustrated a Dante in parchment for Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici, adding that it had been regarded as a marvelous thing. Lorenzo di Pier Francesco was Lorenzo the Magnificent's cousin, and more importantly in our context, a steadfast and imaginative patron of Botticelli from the mid-1480s to the mid-1490s, which really provide the approximate date bracket for the drawings, for the manuscript project. The painting, The Allegory of Spring, the Primavera, now in the Uffizi, was one of those, was an example of Lorenzo di Pier Francesco's very inventive commissions. Like the drawings, it was unprecedented in scale and in its poetic design and ambitions. Not surprisingly, there are correspondences between the two works, such as those between Flora's flower-bedecked dress and the flowers drawn for the 30th canto of Paradise, where Dante describes the ascent to the highest realm of heaven in a stream of light, the 2 banks of the stream painted with all the marvels of spring. So you can see the floral vocabulary between the two probably relies on similar drawings. That said, the manuscript does not appear in any of the inventories taken of Lorenzo's possessions at his death in 1503, and the book more or less disappeared from sight until the separated sheets were recognized as by Botticelli in the 1880s, part of that same revival that was described by Davide earlier at the outset. When they were once again, when in this bringing together and recognition, they were once again regarded as marvelous things. But exactly what sort of things? Since their rediscovery in the 19th century, the drawings have been regarded as masterworks of Botticelli as a draftsman, which they are in even more ways than I can show you today. His profound identification with the poem is proven by a detail in the lower left-hand corner of the illustration to the 28th canto of Paradise. Among the angels arranged hierarchically in the dome of heaven, the 4th in the bottom row holds a tablet or book open towards the beholder. It is inscribed with the artist's name, Sandro di Mariano. The angel's gaze is directed to the figure of Dante, who is in his turn shielding his eyes against the blazing light of the prima mobile, his mind raised to the dazzling heights indicated by Beatrice's raised right arm. The angel's focus is exceptional in Botticelli's portrayal of the celestial host and implies a special tie between the poet and the painter. And I just sort of show you the box so you can see that in their phone booths there. All of the other angels look upwards, ecstatically directing their eyes on height, exactly as described in the poem. The signature, and I show you the entire choir, all the angels looking upwards, but that one. The signature is itself exceptional in Botticelli's oeuvre. It is one of only 2 now identified in his entire painted works. Even so, it is important to understand that Botticelli's masterly visualization of Dante's verses was a contribution to a hugely expensive and coordinated collaboration between specialists in their given arts. I mean, sometimes people seem to imagine that Lorenzo di Pier Francesco, whoever, showed up in Botticelli's workshop one day and said, I killed all these sheep. Could you just get on and make me a Dante? I mean, that is improbable. This kind of thing was not done this way. We know a lot about how manuscripts were produced. Those collaborating, those involved, probably overseen by a kind of master manager, a cartolaio in the profession, included Botticelli, who designed the works, the scribe, who was probably paid the most of anybody, and eventually the miniature painters, and also the manuscript binder. And here I show you one of the reconstructions, or probable reconstructions, of the original format of the book, so that the illuminated manuscript and the text could be seen together. Now, this is not to underestimate at all the value given to Botticelli's part. Even the fact of having a full-page illustration shows how important Botticelli was to whoever commissioned or undertook this extraordinary endeavor. Or that, in fact, the importance that Botticelli gave to his chance to return to Dante on a grand scale. But what precisely was Botticelli's part in this enterprise? It appears that he was the first to be given the parchment sheets, which were full folio size, that is about 12 to 19 inches originally. The precedence of giving the parchment sheets first to the designer reversed the usual priority between illuminating design and the textual inscription, which usually put text before images. However, it seems that somewhere along the way, sheets in various states of finish were handed over to the scribe. A very high-end scribe indeed. This was a man who worked for kings and other things. I mean, he was really a very important scribe, and it's a beautiful scribal hand. The illumination of Inferno was started next on drawings that were fully outlined and ready for coloring. For example, the 10th canto of Inferno, where Dante converses with heretics in their tombs and where the robes of Dante and Virgil have been painted. It is possible that Botticelli, certainly at the beginning of it, sort of took some oversight of the coloring, but he was not a miniature painter, and nor did he have time to illuminate the 100 foreseen cantos. And it's also essential to note that once there was a text, there was a Dante, as the Commedia was often called. Whoever wanted it had his book. The book could be regarded as complete even if its decoration was not, and this was not uncommon in such elaborate manuscript projects. So what we have, therefore, is a really remarkable opportunity to watch the artist at work. He started by making preliminary sketches in metal point, sometimes with a sharp, hard, incisive stylus, and others using a softer one with a higher proportion of lead, leaving a mark. Once the poses and setting were resolved, Botticelli took up his pen and ink and confirmed the contours with deft and graceful lines, sometimes throughout the composition and sometimes not. For example, here in the drawing for the 7th canto of Purgatory, which I show you the whole up there in a detail which I hope is more visible and legible to you, you can see what is happening. So that you have him, the positions of Virgil and Dante and their guide, the poet Sordello, have been determined. But if you look carefully, you can see the underlying indecision and alterations in faint black marks where he started beneath the ink, and then he confirms them in the ink. The sort of curving outline border of their path along the edge of the ledge is inked. Their pauses and conversation are defined. However, the placement of the shades of the negligent rulers, and that's what these are the penitents in this particular canto, the negligent rulers in the valley below, is still in play. And here, once again, to show you where to look more specifically, you can see he's used a soft lead pipe, the sod lead point, and you can see the shade of Henry of Navarre, who, as he sighs, would rest his cheek upon his palm as on a bed. And so he tried it out once and then confirmed it below in the ink. And then you can also see another figure whose pose is in play. Variations in the colors of the ink and the use of stylus in the drawings indicate a prolonged design process, not unexpectedly given the scale and scope of the task, and the fact that Botticelli had many other demands to meet. The number of uninked, tentative, and incomplete drawings increases from 2 for the Inferno to 15 for Purgatory and 18 for Paradise. Here, Paradise Canto 31 with no drawing at all, so you're not seeing anything, it's just not there. And the 32nd canto of Paradise with its minuscule figures of Christ, Mary, and an angel. Now, in that case, Botticelli attempted to draw an angelic choir around the enthroned figures, and then pictured as a kind of distant vision. He's showing the actual vision as a kind of distant vision in heaven, but erased that surrounding glory. What emerges is that, like the pilgrim Dante, Botticelli started in Inferno and moved slowly towards Paradise. And like Dante, Botticelli found the experience almost beyond expression. The varying levels of indecision and resolution in the drawings indicate that Botticelli, unlike the character Dante, sometimes moved back and forth between the cantos. He had more mobility in the realms of Inferno and Purgatory. Also, unlike the pilgrim, he knew what was to come. He'd read the book that was being written. Because we see this because he noted the number and first line of each canto at the bottom of each page. And I show you here the first canto, Purgatory, where percorre miglior acqua, to course more kindly waters, is written at the bottom of the page. And he did that, throughout, before he started work on each canto, so he didn't lose his place among all those sheets on his desk or his table, wherever he was working. In accord with Dante, Botticelli composed the work with the topography of the voyage in dual perspectives, that of the character Dante and that of the reader, being made to see what the traveler is being shown. And this is the whole drawing for the 28th canto of Inferno. The vistas of hell, purgatory, and paradise are put before the eyes of the beholder. You can see it all. The narrative of each canto is fully displayed with the episodic rhythm of the verses translated into vignettes that map the pilgrim's physical and spiritual progress to enlightenment. Here, for example, in this canto, Virgil and Dante appear 3 times, descending they're descending along the rocky bridge deeper into the chasm of the circle of falsifiers and alchemists. They move from top left to bottom right in 3 attitudes. First, with Virgil asking Dante, why does his vision linger there below among the lost and mutilated shadows? The schismatics and sowers of discord of the previous cantos, so he's kind of moving between them. And then, the second time they appear in the middle, moving ahead to the point where Dante felt the force of the strange laments, the arrows, these laments like arrows, so barbed, so pitifully barbed that he had to place his hands over his ears. And then thirdly, climbing to the bottom of the circle and of the page, we're watching and listening to those sick and horrifically suffering souls. Virgil and Dante stop to speak with 2 of them. The page is filled top to bottom, showing you, rendering the stifling as a whole, the stifling atmosphere of hell, the almost unbreathable, the atmosphere without breath possible. He also details, in gruesome detail, the ghastly punishments of these unrepentant sinners. They're shown there unsparingly. The mutilated shade from the previous canto on the top moves out of the picture, carrying, he's shown twice, you have continuous motion here, it's very cinematic, carrying his severed head like a lantern, as he was also speaking, it's a speaking head, like a lantern before him, while in the pit below him, the they are sort of the suffering souls, these sick souls, the falsifiers are spotted with scabs. They're crazed by furious itching, ceaselessly scraping them off themselves and each other with clawing nails, even with sort of biting them off. The visual noise is harsh and bitter, clamorous and unsparing, just as like that characterized in the poem, and just like that Dante had to cover his ears not to hear. The tone changes completely in Purgatory, where the soundtrack is no longer anguish screaming, but one of hopeful prayers and songs of praise. So too does the direction of the voyager's progress, from descending left to right on the page, as you saw, to ascending, as here up the mountain of Purgatory, as here in this illustration to the fourth canto, where Dante and Virgil begin their arduous climb up the mountain. It's steep and rocky terrain, giving shape. It gives shape, it's a sort of metaphorical shape to the notion of the progress of repentance. At the bottom, an eagerly helpful crowd of shades points the way from its base through the crags as Virgil and Dante move up. Exhausted, Dante pleads with Virgil to stop lest he be left behind, because Virgil, being a shade, can move quickly. Dante is still a person, so he's really suffering here. So he asks him to stop, which he does, and they take out on a terrace where they rest while Virgil can explain the Eastern Light. And while there, they hear a voice to the left telling them that they may want to rest. So he's really following the notion of the verse in a pictorial sequence. You read pictorially. Advice, he gets his advice from one of those lazy souls who may be too listless to go first. They were too lazy, so they repented too late, which is why they're left in purgatory. And they're too listless even maybe to go further, so they may never make it beyond purgatory, unlike Dante and Virgil, who continue their trek towards the summit. And here I sort of show you in a series of details that can show you how it moves up the page. The stylistic register also changes, matching the poet's explicit elevation of style. The clamorous crowding of the Inferno is replaced by more orderly spaces. Gruesome sights give way to graceful shapes, like the angels in the 12th and 15th canto who greet Dante at the stairs that will take him to the next terrace, or the lovely lady, I'll show you all three of them, warmed with the rays of love, singing and dancing in the terrestrial paradise of Canto 28. They are suave and dolce, pleasing to the eye, sweet and graceful, like the sweeter sounds of the verses. Even the shades benefit from the grace that infuses purgatory. Now we have to realize that giving form to the imagery of the Inferno and subsequently that of purgatory involved embodying the souls of the punished and penitent, those shamed, their shame manifested by their nakedness. There was no precedent for the number of nudes drawn by Botticelli or poses found by Botticelli in order to illustrate the spirits haunting those realms. It's an extraordinary bodily vocabulary. In the Inferno, the condemned are largely misshapen, shown screaming, coiling, crouching, crawling, and contorted in agony. Here, a selection of usurers on the burning sands from the 17th canto, and then the thieves being changed to serpents from the 25th. Those perverse images, to quote Dante from Canto 25, had even more gruesome companions in the monstrous hybrids and ghouls that formed the diabolic, if sometimes subversively comic, population of hell. I show you a demonic triptych. By contrast, the penitent of purgatory are fully humanized. They have dignified shapes, often referring to models from classical sculpture. Their features are more distinct and defined, their musculature more pronounced, as is evident, for example, in this selection of nudes from the 5th, 6th, and 17th cantos. Based on life study and study after the antique, done from his earliest years, as you can see in the exhibition, Botticelli's extraordinary bodily vocabulary enabled him to enter fully into the drama of the Divine Comedy, visualizing its casts of thousands, from its most abject to its most abstract. From the demon, the evil Malacoda, evil tail, whose tail winds suggestively between his legs, and those of his diabolic tribe in hell, to Dante's transfigured beloved Beatrice, the Pilgrim's Guide to Paradise. Beatrice, whose compassion and beauty imparadises his mind, that's the verb to imparadisare, his mind, and elevating his gaze and intellect, appears as a sacred version of Botticelli's truth, pointing heavenwards in his picturing, Botticelli's picturing of calumny in the pictures in Uffizi, and Beatrice from the 25th canto, which also we have to talk about what this does about the meaning of hair here. But I think hair and desire are actually connected. It's what you decide to desire when you see this beautiful hair. But anyway, the sort of the connection, however, is really quite logical between the figure of truth and the figure of Beatrice. Because, of course, Beatrice is showing this pointing upwards gesture is quite frequent in the Paradise because she is pointing to the greatest truths ever, the heavenly truth, the divine truth that will lift Dante's mind towards divine understanding. And she does so. Now, it sort of gives that way of contending with what is inevitable, just get to this truth. Dante repeatedly, indeed, reminds his reader of the dilemma of describing things that are beyond the capacity of written expression, along with the necessity of finding a style that meets that of his subject. Following Dante, who makes grace the keynote of the most divine part of the comedy, Botticelli made the graceful figure of Beatrice the center of the pilgrim Dante and the beholder's attention, a nymph-like and sacred parallel to the dancing graces of the Primavera. She is a figure of grace itself. By restricting figuration largely to Dante's absorption in Beatrice's gaze and her loving guidance, Botticelli continued to visualize the pilgrim's experience along with that of the inexpressibility of passing beyond the human, transuminar, to get beyond the human. So the perspective changes once again in accordance with the nature of the space, now geometrical and regular. It is without terrain, but it does have an order. He didn't simply say, oh, let's have some circles and put these guys in them. He really is following what's happening in the text, which that order is explained to Dante and, of course, to the reader in the second canto, which you see here of Paradise, and which Botticelli shows in a diagram of the cosmos. He's showing where you're going to go in concentric circles with the earth at the center. In the following cantos, Beatrice and Dante are pictured inside each circle as they move up through the celestial spheres until they reach the heaven of the fixed stars and Dante's first vision of Christ in the 22nd canto. At this point, heaven becomes a dome, a transition shown in that canto, so you still have the circle, they're within a circle, but the space is now the surrounding of the spinning flames of the heavenly host around them, and after that, it retains its dome-like shape. Botticelli's focus on Dante and Beatrice was not at all formulaic. It was not a simple cop-out. He was fully aware of where the poet Dante had placed them, of their saintly interlocutors and of the subjects of their conversations. Here in the 26th canto, where Dante is being interrogated about the theological virtue of charity and is temporarily blinded by the blazing light of the radiance of the saints around him, Botticelli pictures the radiance in flames, labeling the names of the questioners, so they are actually identified. He did not illustrate, however, or emblematize the theological, doctrinal, or political expositions of Paradise that constitute that final stages of the pilgrim Dante's instructive journey to spiritual enlightenment. Instead, he pictured the his absorption, Dante's absorption, in Beatrice's loving direction, relying on the viewer's reading or knowledge of the text to give voice to the images. That dependence was intrinsic to Botticelli's pictorial poetics, which engage with Dante's visibile parlar, that is, speech made visible. The phrase that describes God's handiwork in the 10th canto of Purgatory. In that canto, when the two travelers climb up to the first territory of Purgatory, that of pride, they are faced with a bank of white marble adorned with carvings, 3 reliefs with examples of humility: the Annunciation, David dancing before the ark, and the Emperor Trajan pledging to avenge the death of a poor widow's son. God's creation, those reliefs, they surpass the work of the greatest sculptor of antiquity and of nature itself. Dante describes each scene in detail, his verses intended to stimulate the inner vision of his readers, to make his images speak to their imaginative faculty and their memory. Botticelli's task was the reverse, to arrive at a visual eloquence that would align with the imagery and resonate with the words of the text. Botticelli made full use of his pictorial art to picture gods. Here again, he illustrated the movement of the pilgrims up onto and along the terrace and their viewing of each relief. He detailed, just like Dante did in the text, the subject of those stories, the progressive stages of Dante's enthralled looking, and even does this sort of one showing that he's looking and then he's bowing like the Virgin Annunciate, a sort of stop action picture there. And then he's so enthralled, Virgil has to keep moving him along. At the end of the terrace, where they also see the penitent proud, bent down, crawling beneath heavy stones, like corbel figures that support a roof, an architectural metaphor that Botticelli realized in melding the rocky edges with the frame of the Trajan relief. Befitting their divine manufacture, the carvings are monumental. Befitting their definition as works of art, the scenes are framed and they're shown in perspective. They're the only scenes, the ones that are pictures within pictures that are in perspective. And you can see him, I hope you can sort of make out, Botticelli is trying to figure out the perspective, and he has a distance point, a center point in it, in the central scene of this. This construction distinguishes them generically from the experiential spaces of the pilgrim's journey. The underdrawing in the central scene shows Botticelli in the course of plotting the perspective and working out the background. The ambitious nature of the illustration to Cantor is evident in the amount of underdrawing and a number of unresolved portions. But its self-conscious status as a work of the artist is also evident in its display of compositional skill, its levels of representation, and its implicit play on ways of seeing and being seen. So when Dante moves on to look more closely at the story of Trajan, he is placed to look at onlookers within the story. Onlookers who are anomalous and anachronistic in that turbulent scene from Roman antiquity. They are, however, types of curious and cocky young men familiar in Botticelli's works from an early date, and whom you can get to know in the drawing from Lille in the exhibition. Their insertion is not a signature, but it is a signature gesture. Delight in witnessing is one of the pilgrim's reactions to the carvings. It is manifestly one that Botticelli sought to elicit generally in his drawings for the Divine Comedy, keenly aware of ways of seeing, looking, and wondering in the poem. Like Beatrice and Dante in Paradise Canto 24, or, by contrast, ogling. Like the demons of hell, who are the only figures in the entire set of drawings who look outwards towards the onlooker, as though mischievously ready to receive you. Okay, transcendently angelic or mischievously diabolic, delight in witnessing is the great pleasure now open to you here in the extraordinary exhibition, however you choose to fix your gaze. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. And now we're ready to take some questions, and I ask the speakers to come on stage. As someone is going to help set the chairs. Come. So, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pat. Please.
We had to get all the way to heaven.
That's true. Bravissimo. No, andate voi. Thank you. And have a seat. And who wants to ask a question? We have someone with a microphone around, probably, but otherwise we can. So I have a first question to Davide. I was my impression, but maybe I'm wrong, is that the revival of Botticelli in the collecting history, especially in America, is very much focused on the religious paintings rather than the mythological ones or the portraits, which are, I mean, if you think of Botticelli now, is very much associated with, the flowering of the mythological Renaissance and Florence, and with his beauty of the portraits. But I saw a lot of emphasis on the religious one. Is that correct, or?
I think that seems to be.
Yes, that's working. No, come on.
This is on, but it doesn't work. Yeah. Okay, now it works. Okay. I think that, obviously the mythological paintings, they are in some way a small portion of Botticelli's paintings, and they were mostly in Italy, in Florence. I would say that American collectors, they chose what in some way was available, and obviously religious paintings, but also portraits, because there are some important portraits in American collections now. So I would say that it was more what was available really on the market. The important thing was to get one Botticelli.
Thank you. Questions? Yes. So the question is about the chart of L. So
yes.
I just repeat it for the audience online. Who colored it? And
well, we don't know. We don't know who might have been charged to be the illuminators. He was connected to one of the premier, he had worked with the Gerardo di Monte workshop. There was a workshop where he had other commissions worked with him. What I think happened is that it is only drawings from the Inferno that have any color in them, because they were probably the most complete at the time. And I have a feeling that some of the missing drawings from the Inferno might have also been colored. That's why they were sort of excerpted from it. The fact of the Chart of Hell having been one of the first to be done and most complete to be done, he probably knew that the best. That is the one that relies most on conventional illustrations. It's the one that you could almost say is fully conventional. So that was probably done and ready to be painted. The others that have been painted are less regular. It's not as though they went from 1, 2, 3, 4 onwards. It was really more what was the most complete in its instruction to be handed over. But as I say, by that time, the project had probably lagged on for quite a while, and whoever wanted his book and had the text said, okay, it's beautiful, let's go. I've got to give it to the King of France. For example, if that's one idea that might have happened. If Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco had it, it could have been a diplomatic gift and just had to be considered done.
Which I believe, to your point, in the exhibition we have the beautiful manuscript from Ravenna with Petrarch Triumph of Love, where we have the written page, which is fully decorated, and Botticelli's was not done. The analyses have demonstrated that all the background and the colored washes, additions were done later. So that was considered finished, and certainly the manuscript was delivered as it is now.
Was really not at all uncommon. You know, the exceptional part of this case is the scale and scope of the drawings.
Yeah.
That you allowed that much space to drawing.
Thank you. Yes.
Do we have any? Oh, I'm sorry.
You have the mic. Great.
Hello. Okay.
Yes.
Do we have any historical evidence of how the birth of Venus may have escaped the bonfire of the vanities? Because it seems like the one thing that Savonarola would want to burn them like the most.
Or just use that one.
I mean, anyone can answer this. This is one of the paintings we know so little about. It came out quite late. It was in a private villa. So it's, in a way, what we see now and the fame it received and the visibility it gets, it's very much a product of the 20th century because it's, you know, it was behind closed doors and so on. And of course, visitors and guests would have seen it. But the historical record is extremely slim for that specific painting. That's kind of like pretty normal. Like the perceptions we have of the Renaissance, what we consider a masterpiece, or what we have lacked it as such, does not necessarily correspond to what they perceived as the masterpieces, and they saw. And they could see, actually, right? Because now we have access to paintings that were not in public, right? Actually, museums are mostly made of private paintings, right?
So Savonarola may not have existed?
Well, even if he did, Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco, who did own it, was not a Savonarola's. He took advantage of being part of the Florentine Republic as that happened, but he just might have said, forget it. You know, you know, I'm not throwing this into the bonfire or anything else. And there were people, even who were Savonarola, who owned things that you might have said to do it, but they didn't get quite involved in that hysteria. So it also had to do with the position of the owner.
Yeah. Yes.
This is from Michelle O'Malley. One of the interesting aspects I got from this exhibition is the scale anomalies that I find in so many paintings. Some of the figures much larger than you would nominally expect and smaller. For instance, the Virgin in the Mystic Nativity is bigger than the horse and so forth. And you've described the use of spolvero or pouncing and the use of a sort of a cartoon to repeat. Is it possible that any of these scale anomalies derived from copying something at a forced scale, a scale forced by the spolvero, and then saying, well, the figure has to be this big as a consequence?
I think that is not what is behind those differences in scale. Towards the end of Botticelli's career, he seemed to forego scale to a certain extent and to make the holy figures bigger, for instance, than other figures. I mean, what we saw that second Botticelli that Bernard Berenson was so horrified by, that second picture, that Joseph is huge. I think this is a consequence of his vision at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Cartoons could easily be scaled up and down, and people knew how to do it.
Please, yes. Is it always certain? Who wants to answer that? Should I do it? You. I think, you know, we can look at the exhibition together, and but generally speaking, to generalize, workshop drawings have a mechanical appearance, a mechanical aspect. There's a continuity of the line, there's the same width of the line. The Botticelli drawing, autograph drawings, they have they're much more dynamic, they're much more different. There's a rhythmic difference within the same drawing that differentiate them from something that is more pedantic, so to speak. Yes.
if I can add something, because this is really a sort of a methodological question, very, very important. In some way, art history as never as a scientific discipline, but art history as a discipline developed through connoisseurship. And this was something that, in some way, I was trying to show in my talk, and then Furio sort of applies when he looks at drawings. So it's based on observation, it's based on qualities of the individual works, comparison with other works that are securely attributed to the hand of the master by documents, or by we know because they were preparatory for something. So obviously there is a degree of certainty, but very often we disagree among us. So there are often disagreements. I would say that in the last 20, 30 years, and this was shown, I think, very well today, these technical scientific investigations, for example, looking at under drawings in paintings, helped a lot to refine or to add a further component to connoisseurship. Connoisseurship basically is based on our eye and experience of looking many things. Scientific investigation helped a lot because we can now see things that before were not possible to see. And so they help in some way to refine our knowledge and to, sometimes have more firm opinions about paintings or drawings.
Yeah. Yes, down there.
Although it's my understanding that Botticelli was relatively high profile as an artist even during his life, do we know, in terms of the Dante's Inferno illustrations, do we know who that could have been for? Or do we have any insight into who it could have been gifted to?
Well, as I say, with the Dante illustrations, there's this one reference to them in 1540s series of notes that they were done for this Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, which is a very logical one, and the fact that this is such a specific piece of information suggests that it's true. As in, the problem about that piece of information is the book is not in the inventory of Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco's death inventory or appear in the library inventories that follow. So you have a mid-16th century association of the project, but with Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco, but there's nothing more. Would that one could find something more, like a commission, and it'd be a commission to the cartellaio who oversaw the project, but really it remains one of the big question marks.
Yes.
I was wondering, as far as the hair goes, and the braids,
yes.
And the braids, did that apply to unmarried women or married women as well?
Braids, right?
Yeah, the women who had to braid their hair.
So every hairstyle starts with a braid. I mean, it's usually the big one that you see on the back. Mm-hmm. Then the difference is that married women in public need to wear a veil, right? In public, which means also sometimes that a lot of the portraits we see, the kind of private portraits, so they're kept in the house. So basically, they can take off their veil, right? Mm-hmm. The braiding is just like a sort of the key, like the basic, way of keep hair in order. It's just that the difference of the finesse of the numbers that kind of make a difference. But the big braid goes on the back and then you put on the top. That's the sort of most basic hairstyle.
And could be worn by married or unmarried?
By maids, by people in the streets. That's the one way to kind of keep it clean and tight, right?
Okay.
And then, but the braids, the things that when you start having lots of braids, like in the case of possibly the portrait of Simonetta, then there's a level of, let's say, hairstyling and elaborations that in such a different level of care and status and so on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now you already asked a question, sorry. Yes. Yes, this man here. I'm ruthless. You haven't been at my lecture, sorry, I'm very... You have your mic.
Yeah, we understand what, enlightenment and Buddhism is. But I heard one of the speakers talk about enlightenment. During that period, how does one consider themselves enlightened?
Pat.
We're not talking about sort of 18th century sense of enlightenment. We're talking about an interior form of understanding in which you progressed toward the light. I mean, it's sort of taken that way, where your mind is lifted from material, coarse things to be able to contemplate, to be able to even see mentally things that you are incapable of being seen. And the metaphor really of light, of being illuminated. So that would be the historicized concept of being enlightened. It's more philosophical or theological, religious, it's devotional, it's a spiritual concept.
Yeah. One last question, the last one. Yes.
I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about collaboration among artists versus competition. I thought the Sybil discussion was so fascinating. I'm a theater person, so we always make art collaboratively, but then in the show there's that, I think it's a Verrocchio that's part of a competition. How much did public competition or church competition sort of drive production of work and subject matter versus this sort of collaboration that makes it so hard to know individual authorship? Does that make sense?
That's a great question, and I think both Jacqueline and Michelle, but Jacqueline, you first, yes, we can answer this.
Well, in the case of the Sybils, I sort of think what distinguishes them from most collaborations is that they are almost a pattern that you can compare quite easily. So if it was, I mean, this is just really very hypothetical, that you sort of have this sort of idea that you design 10 speaking figures, how do you do that? And you have the workshop there with you, sort of doing that. That's wishful thinking. I mean, don't know how that sort of, but I mean, the competition in Florence was huge. I mean, there was Verrocchio, there was the Pollaiolo workshop, there's Botticelli, sort of, so they cooperate. I mean, if they make a cassone, if they do designs, there's always a cooperation. If it's goldsmiths, if it's printers, it's a group of artists working together. But then they have different cliques in a way that they compete then sort of with each other.
In the workshop, the impression is that there is more collaboration than we have normally thought. It isn't the master painter saying, do this, or saying nothing except, hand me that brush, please. You have a sense of the members working together with Botticelli to produce work that needs to get out. And even on commission works, which I didn't really talk about today, the workshop, some workshop members would be assigned to do certain parts.
I also,
I think
yeah.
perhaps just sort of something else. Lippi stays with Botticelli, Leonardo stays with Verrocchio very long. I mean, I sort of think relationships, I mean, there are sort of some relationships that we know of master and pupil, especially in Florence, I think, where people work together really well and then sort of stay sort of together, and it's not necessarily a master and pupil sort of relationship anymore.
There's also another aspect we didn't talk at all about, but there's an institutions called arts, the guild that, oversees them, and they become members to it. So there's also that kind of umbrella on top of that. So even when there's a competition, there's still some sort of kind of brotherhood.
But especially for public commissions or works that were commissioned that were displayed in public. There was fierce competition in Florence in the 15th century, since the beginning of the century, the famous Ghiberti doors, and then going on. And there were real competition to assign commission to certain artists for a certain work, for a certain painting or fresco or sculptures.
And I also think, just to add, that sense of there were people who collaborated regularly, they worked together regularly. There were some painters, some commissions were so big you subcontracted to someone out from somewhere else, but there had to be compatibility. On the other hand, the spirit of competition, which was really fierce, also accounts for the sort of stylistic self-definition that these shops took on a personality to be identified with certain kinds of works, a certain way of working, so that you can see that, you know, the Ghirlandaio shop or the Verrocchio, the Ghirlandaio shop and the Poleolo shop and the Botticelli shop were actually producing things in very different manners, even if they were the same kind of work. So it is a intersecting and yet stimulating environment, competitive environment.
Yeah. I think unlike Ghirlandaio or Pollaiolo, though, Botticelli sourced very distinctive personalities. They have a more autonomous style for specific commissions. Raffaellino del Garbo for embroideries. He was working with Sangallo for wood marquetries, Gherardo del Fora for the mosaics and miniatures and the illuminations. While under Ghirlandaio, the style was much more controlled and kept really much more homogeneous, while with Botticelli we have wide differentiations of.
And that's what I meant when I said that he's seen as a master of design, and that is a category that he would, that is one imprint of his shop. And I think, you know, he got that, you know, that was part of his identification of an artist, that production of designs that were really going to go elsewhere for other kinds of work that he did not do.
Yeah.
He's not a woodworker.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to our 5 speakers who delivered incredibly thoughtful and interesting talk today. Go see the exhibition. There's 30 more minutes, I think, and spread the word about it. Our next lecture will be on December 9th, and have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.